What Happened Here? By M.D. Vale, an audio novella.
Nadia, I need to tell you about Claire Ashworth before I tell you anything else. Not because she's the beginning. She's not really. Every story like this one has a longer root system than it shows, tangled down in soil you don't think to examine until something pulls you flat. But Claire is where I felt it, where the ground finally gave. So she's where I'll start, even if starting there means admitting things about myself I spent a long time not admitting. Nothing that happened to me. Not Vermont, not Jake, not the night I lay on the floor of my own studio convinced I was going to die. None of it makes sense without her. She is where this story starts. She is where I broke. I had been doing true crime for almost a decade when I found her case. 10 years. 10 years of sitting across tables from people who were surviving the unsurvivable and asking them, gently, carefully, with every ounce of professional grace I had, to take me back to the worst moment of their lives and walk me through it slowly. 10 years of crime scene photographs spread across my kitchen table at midnight. Of autopsy reports with their clinical language that somehow made things more horrifying, not less. Of interviews with detectives who had seen too much and decided the only way to keep doing the job was to stop letting it touch them, and defense attorneys who had made peace with a moral flexibility I never entirely understood. I was good at it. I want to be honest about that, not because I'm proud of it, though I was, but because it matters for what comes later. I was really, genuinely good at it. And I'd made peace with that the way you make peace with any fact about yourself that's neither wholly comfortable nor wholly something you can change. I knew how to hold a room. I knew how to sit inside someone's grief, right inside it, close enough that they could feel I was there, without letting it pull me under. I knew how to find the one thread in a story that everyone else had walked past and pull on it until the whole thing unraveled. That was my gift. Or what I thought was my gift. It took Claire Ashworth to show me the difference between holding someone's pain and actually letting it land. Claire was a kindergarten teacher in Indianapolis, 34 years old. She had a cat named Senator, a standing Sunday phone call with her mother, and a habit, this specific, tender habit I kept coming back to, of staying late on Fridays to sharpen all the pencils for Monday. So her kids would walk into a classroom on Monday morning that was already ready for them, already saying, "You're expected here. You're wanted." She disappeared on a Thursday afternoon in March. There, one moment, gone the next, somewhere between the parking lot of her school and her apartment 6 blocks away, in the ordinary space of an ordinary afternoon, she simply ceased to be findable. 11 days later, a jogger found her in a drainage ditch 12 miles from the city. I want to pause there for a moment because I think we move past these details too quickly in this kind of work. 11 days, a drainage ditch, 12 miles. These are coordinates. They are not a person. But I have trained myself professionally to hold the coordinates separate from the person because if you don't, if you let every detail be a person, you go under. You stop functioning. So, 11 days, a drainage ditch, 12 miles. I'm getting better at letting them be a person. It's harder, and I think it's right. I picked up the case 18 months after the fact. The police had arrested a man named Marcus Webb, a tenant in her building, a man with a history of disputes and a temper he hadn't fully managed to hide from the people around him. The evidence against him was circumstantial, but it was stacked, layered, each piece leaning against the next. He went to trial, got convicted, got 25 to life. Most people considered it closed. I didn't consider it closed. Something about the timeline bothered me in that specific, nagging way, the way a picture hanging 1 degree off level bothers you, just below the threshold of articulation. You look at the wall and something's wrong, and you can't name it, but you can't stop seeing it. I started pulling threads. 8 months. I spent 8 months on that case, and I want you to understand what that actually looked like, what it cost before I move past it. 8 months of re-interviews and records requests and late nights with coffee going cold at my elbow and a whiteboard in my apartment covered in timelines that I added to and erased and redrew until the surface was ghosted with old marker, the traces of dead ends. I interviewed 31 people. I drove to Indianapolis 4 times, rented the same mid-sized sedan each time, stayed at the same Marriott, ordered the same room service because by the 3rd trip I'd run out of the energy to make new choices. I sat in the gallery of the original trial and read every word of the transcript with a pencil in my hand, making notes in the margins until the margins ran out, and I started writing in the white spaces between paragraphs. I was looking for the thing that was off. I was certain it was there.
What I found, 4 months later, in another pass through witness statements, was a gap in the story where a person should have been. A second person in that building that night. Someone with access. Someone whose presence nobody had accounted for, because nobody had thought to look. I didn't know who. I built the episode around the question, around the shape of the absence, and I aired it, and it got 14 million downloads in the first week. The prosecutor's office reopened the investigation. Marcus Webb, in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirmed it. A man with a score to settle. A man who had shown up that night and what happened had not been planned, but it had happened and Webb had not stopped it. I went home to my apartment in Brooklyn. I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. with my back against the cold side of the tub, and I cried for the first time in 10 years of doing this work. Not the careful, managed tears of a person in control of herself. The other kind. The kind that surprises you with how much is in there, how long it's apparently been waiting. Here is the specific, private cost of that episode. The part I didn't tell anyone about for a long time, that I'm telling you now, because I think it's important to be honest, even when honesty requires a kind of courage. I'm still developing. After the downloads, after the acclaim, after the prosecutor's call, after all of it, I went to my files and I pulled out every photograph from the investigation, not the crime scene ones, the before ones, Claire at her sister's wedding, laughing with her mouth completely open, the way you only laugh when you don't know anyone's watching, when nothing is performed. The joy on her face so unguarded it was almost hard to look at directly. Claire in her classroom, kneeling beside a small child who was crying, her hand flat and steady on the child's back, her body curved toward him in a way that said, "I have nowhere else to be. There is nothing more important than this moment, and this moment is yours." I looked at those photographs for a long time, and I thought about the second person in that building. The one I know was there but didn't know the name of. I know what my therapist would say. What Dr. Patricia Wee, excellent woman, unfortunate name, has said many times in many carefully measured ways. You couldn't have known. You followed the evidence. You did everything right. And the rational part of me, the part I'd spent 10 years carefully constructing and reinforcing, knows that's true. But here's what I couldn't put down. Here's the thing that lodged itself somewhere beneath the rational part and refused to be reasoned with. I stopped sleeping. Not dramatically. Gradually, the way erosion works. Slow and persistent and difficult to notice until the damage is done. 4 hours became 3. 3 became 2 on the bad nights, the ones where the classroom was waiting every time I closed my eyes. The small chairs. The pencils sharpened for Monday. For children who came back to a substitute teacher and didn't understand why things had changed. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my recording studio and ran through the entire process of going inside. Saw myself opening the door, climbing the stairs, sitting down at the board, and still couldn't make myself move. I went through the motions of my life with the specific, competent hollowness of a person who knows exactly how functioning looks from the outside and can reproduce it on command. I answered emails. I kept appointments. I smiled at my neighbors. I was disappearing and nobody could see it because I was very, very good at not disappearing in public. And then Dr. Wee sat across from me in her office on a Wednesday in March and said, with the directness I had always valued and currently found devastating, "Nadia, you need to stop. Not pause. Stop.
Go somewhere quiet and stay there until you remember what quiet feels like." I didn't argue. That was how far gone I was. I didn't even argue. I Googled small Vermont towns at midnight, sitting cross-legged on my bed with the blue light making everything feel provisional and strange. I found Hazel Creek, population 3,000, a photograph of a main street with snow still on the ground and a mountain behind it that looked like it had been there long enough to have opinions. I emailed a woman named Dorothy Briggs about her cottage rental. She wrote back in 20 minutes, 12:30 in the morning, which told me something about her that I liked immediately. 3 weeks later, I was driving north on I-91 with one box of recording equipment I told myself I was bringing just in case, a laptop with nothing open on it, and the dreams still there in the passenger seat like an uninvited guest I'd somehow agreed to carpool with. I thought I was running toward quiet. I didn't know yet what I was running with. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to know about the town first. You need to know about Jake. And then I'll tell you about the night everything I'd been running from caught up with me in a room I thought was safe.
Jake, let me tell you what Hazel Creek looks like in October, because if you're going to understand any of what happened, any of it, you need to be able to see it first. You need to be standing inside it before the story starts moving. The roads curve around the landscape instead of cutting through it, built by men who understood instinctively that some things shouldn't be forced into straight lines. Getting anywhere takes slightly longer than you think it should, and after you've lived here long enough, you stop thinking it should take any other amount of time. You stop measuring it against somewhere else entirely. That's when you know the town has gotten into you properly. The covered bridge over Hazel Creek was built in 1886 by my great-great-grandfather Emmett Rafferty, who kept meticulous records. I know this for a fact. Can tell you the timber came from the hillside north of town. Can tell you it took 11 men and a mule named Congress to haul it down to the creek bed. I grew up with that bridge the way other kids grow up with family photographs. It was just there. It was just ours. I used to sit on the railing as a boy and drop sticks into the water and watch them disappear into the dark underneath and come out the other side, and I understood even then, in the wordless way children understand things that are true, that some structures are built to last longer than the people who build them, and that this is its own kind of love. The town hall was built in 1892 and smells like old wood and beeswax and the specific dignity of a building that has been properly maintained across generations by people who understood that maintenance is a form of respect. Main Street is 2 blocks long. There is a general store that has been run by the same family for 40 years, a coffee shop called Birch and Grounds, where the espresso is genuinely good and the gossip is better, a library that outperforms every expectation you'd have walking in, and a cidery run by my friend Phil Sorrento that produces the best hard cider in Vermont, and I will defend that claim against anyone who wants to make it a conversation. In October, the trees go absolutely insane with color. Every hillside becomes something you'd call exaggerated if you saw it in a painting. Golds and reds and oranges so saturated they seem lit from within, like the trees are burning slowly and happily and with complete intention. I have watched this happen every year of my life, and I still catch myself stopped on a job site with my hands at my sides, just looking, feeling it land somewhere in my chest the way it always does. I'm not embarrassed by that. A man who stops being moved by beautiful things has lost something he may not get back. And I've seen enough of what men can lose that I take the feeling seriously when it comes. This is where I was born. This is what I came back to. This is what I was standing in the middle of when everything changed. I left at 18. 8 years in the United States Army. I'll tell you the parts that matter when they become relevant to what happened here, because some things earn their place in a story by being necessary and not before. What I'll tell you now is this. I went in as one kind of man and came out as another kind entirely. And the second kind was quieter than the first in ways that weren't always visible from the outside, but were complete and permanent on the inside. The Army gave me things I didn't go looking for. It gave me a precise understanding of my own capacity, what I could endure, what I could do under pressure, what I was made of when the situation stripped everything else away. It gave me the ability to be still when stillness was required, and to move without hesitation when movement was. It gave me a tolerance for discomfort and a very low tolerance for dishonesty, including the dishonesty of pretending to feel things I didn't feel or not feel things I did. It took things. I won't catalog them here. Every man who has been in that life knows the ledger, and the accounting is private. I came back at 26 because my father had a stroke. He was alone in the house on Birch Street. The house I grew up in, the house his father had built, the house that smelled like wood smoke and motor oil and the specific combination of materials that means home in a way no other word quite reaches. There was no decision to be made. I came back. I learned the business from him in the 14 months I had left with him. Rafferty Construction, third generation, the outfit that built half the original structures in this town and had spent the decades since keeping them standing, which turns out to be the more important half of the work. My father taught me that. He said anyone can put something up. The craft is in making it last. He died 14 months after I came home. I stayed because leaving felt like losing him twice, and once had been enough. I stayed because the business was real, and the work was honest, and the people were people I had known my whole life. And there is something in that continuity. Something I hadn't understood the value of until I'd spent 8 years without it. That holds a man together in ways he doesn't always notice until he imagines its absence. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of building things and fixing things and running a crew of men I respected in a town I understood. And the life had been good. Genuinely good. Full in the ways that matter. But I am going to be honest with you because this story requires honesty and I don't have much patience for the other kind. There was something missing. Had been for a while. Not the dramatic, obvious absence of a thing you can name and point to. More like a room in a house that's always slightly cold, that you learn to walk past without going in because you've stopped expecting it to be warm. I'd made my peace with it. I told myself the peace was enough, and most days it was. Most days. Here is what you need to understand about me before this story moves forward. I am not a man with a lot of noise in his head. The Army trained most of it out, and what the Army didn't reach, 5 years of physical work in a place I loved finished off. I know who I am. I know what I value. I know my own limits, and I know what I'm capable of, and I don't spend significant time pretending either of those things is different from what they are. I have been called difficult to read. I've been called closed off. Both of those things are probably accurate from the outside. From the inside, it's simpler. I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't perform things I don't feel. And I've found over time that this approach, while it occasionally makes social situations more complicated, saves everyone a considerable amount of time in the long run. I am patient. That is the most important thing to understand about me for what's coming. Patient in the way of a man who has learned, through experience, through loss, through years of work that cannot be rushed without being ruined, that the right thing done at the wrong time is just a wrong thing with better intentions. I can hold a position. I can see something clearly and let it come to me rather than going after it before the ground is ready because I have assessed enough situations to know that forcing the timing almost never works and costs you more than waiting would have. The Army taught me one other thing that matters here. It taught me what it feels like when something wakes up in you that had gone quiet. The specific low register of recognition, below conscious thought, below language, in the part of a man that processes the world faster than words, the part that has been trained to assess and trust the assessment. I hadn't felt that in a long time. I was about to. Gus Pelletier. I need to tell you about Gus before I tell you anything else, because Gus is threaded through this story in a way that still puts a weight on my chest that I don't expect to put down anytime soon, and I want you to know who he was before you know what happened to him. He was my foreman, my father's oldest friend, 30 years of working alongside the elder Rafferty, which meant he'd known me since I was small enough to ride on his shoulders at job sites, which he did more than once and which I have chosen to remember as a gesture of affection rather than a safety violation. 53 years old, built like a man who had never once in his life done anything except physical work, with gray coming in at his temples and hands like shovels and eyes that could find the load-bearing truth of any situation, a structure, a problem, a person, in about 30 seconds flat and without making a production of it. 31 years, married to Rosie. A daughter in Burlington, a son in Portland, a house on Orchard Street that he had renovated 3 times with his own hands, once per decade, Rosie reconsidering the kitchen each time, Gus rebuilding it without complaint. He had a laugh you could hear from 2 rooms away. Opinions about the Red Sox delivered with the finality of verdicts and the specific quality of presence that belongs to people who are entirely comfortable being exactly where they are. He was the closest thing to family I had left in Hazel Creek. I say that plainly because it's true and because it matters for what comes later. He told me once, early morning, coffee in the parking lot of the town hall site, the comfortable kind of conversation that happens between men who don't need a reason to talk, that the secret to a good life was simple. Find your work, find your person, stay. No more complicated than that. What if you don't find the person? I asked. He looked at me with the expression he reserved for things he found self-evidently obvious. Then you keep your eyes open until you do. That's not philosophy, Rafferty. That's just paying attention. I thought about that a lot in the weeks before October, whether I'd been paying attention, whether I'd let some part of me go quiet in a way that had stopped being recovery and started being something more like surrender, to the idea that the cold room was just going to stay cold, that the missing thing was going to stay missing, that the ledger from the Army had taken more than I'd acknowledged. And then October came. Dorothy Briggs called me. A woman drove into Hazel Creek in a 9-year-old Subaru and knocked the Henderson mailbox flat without slowing down and parked in front of the cottage across the 40 feet from my front porch and didn't come back out. And something in the part of me that processes things faster than language said, pay attention. So I did. Every foundation is laid before anyone sees the walls go up. My father taught me that about construction and about most other things worth building. You do the work underground first. You make it solid, you make it true. And then you wait, with the patience of a man who knows what he's built, for the thing to rise in its own time. I didn't know her yet. I didn't know what she'd been through, or what it had cost her, or what she'd come here to put back together. But I knew, with the specific certainty of a man who has learned to trust the part of himself that operates below language, that whatever was about to happen was going to matter. Some things you just know. I've stopped questioning that.
Nadia. The drive from Brooklyn to Hazel Creek is about 4.5 hours, depending on where you hit the traffic coming out of the city and whether you stop in Brattleboro for coffee, which I did, because I am a person who requires caffeine the way certain machinery requires hydraulic fluid. Not optional, not negotiable, just physics. I want to tell you about that drive. Not because anything happened on it, but because it was the last time I was alone with just myself and the road and my own uninterrupted thoughts. And even though I didn't know that then, I know it now. And that matters. The last time you have something is always significant in retrospect, even when it passes without ceremony. The first 2 hours were city and then suburb and then that long stretch of Connecticut highway that is neither beautiful nor interesting, just miles of pure purpose, existing only to be driven through and left behind. I spent them the way I'd spent most of my time that year, inside my own head in the loop, the case, the things I should have asked, the things I did ask and somehow failed to hear or see correctly. The classroom, Claire's classroom, with the small chairs and the sharpened pencils and the substitute teacher standing in front of children who didn't understand why everything had changed. By the time I crossed into Massachusetts, I had been around that loop 7 times. I knew every inch of it. I could have walked it in my sleep, and some nights I did. That was the problem. The knowing didn't stop it. It never stopped it. I was exhausted by my own mind the way you get exhausted by a song you can't get out of your head, except the song was made of guilt, and it never reached a resolution, and there was no off switch I'd been able to find. And then Vermont happened. I don't know how else to say it. The interstate ended. The smaller road began. And suddenly, almost all at once, like a door opening, the world on both sides of me went green and gold and red, and the sky was doing something with its blue that city skies never quite manage, something deep and clear and unapologetic about it. I rolled the window down without thinking, because I wanted it in the car with me. The smell of it. Leaves and cold water and something underneath that was just clean, in a way I didn't have a word for, in a way that reached past all my professional vocabulary and just registered as, this is what air is supposed to be. I stopped thinking about the classroom, Not forever. Not even for very long. 20 minutes, maybe. Perhaps a little more. But for those 20 minutes, I was just a woman driving through Vermont in October with the window down, and the cold coming in, and the color of the trees doing something to the inside of my chest that I hadn't been expecting. I wasn't anywhere. I wasn't the case or the podcast or the guilt or the loop. I was just present in my body, in the car, in the particular golden afternoon. 20 minutes. It sounds like nothing. It was not nothing. It was the most present I'd been in months, and I felt it. Felt the difference. The way you feel the sun on your face after a long time indoors, with your whole person. I found Hazel Creek at 4 p.m, which is to say I found it in the particular October light that happens when the sun gets low and everything it touches looks lit from within. The trees didn't look like trees. They looked like something deliberate. I drove down Main Street at something like 10 miles an hour, maybe less, because I physically couldn't make myself go faster and I didn't try. There was a covered bridge at the end of Main Street crossing a creek that ran amber and quick over smooth gray rocks. There was a general store with a hand-painted open sign and a dog asleep on the porch with the absolute boneless confidence of an animal that has never once doubted its right to be exactly where it is. There was a coffee shop with steam on the inside of the windows, and I was almost certain Aaron Lewis music coming through the door every time someone opened it. I thought, okay. Quietly, carefully, like a thing I didn't want to spook. Maybe Dr. Wee was right. I turned onto Maplebrook Road. And then I hit the Henderson mailbox. I'm not going to pretend that was anything other than what it was. I was looking at a maple tree in someone's yard. A spectacular maple. I want that on the record. The kind of tree that makes you understand why people drive hours to look at foliage. And I drifted, and the tire caught the post, and the whole structure went over in one clean, catastrophic arc, like it had been waiting for exactly this. The sound it made was essentially a gunshot, a flat, declarative crack that bounced off the trees and then went still. I sat in the car with my hands on the wheel and my heart knocking against my ribs and looked at the mailbox in my rearview mirror. The little red flag was still up. Optimistic to the last. Noted, I told it, because apparently I had started talking to inanimate objects somewhere in the last terrible year and hadn't fully stopped. I drove to the cottage. It was small and white and exactly what the photograph had promised, which felt like a minor miracle after a year in which almost nothing had been what it promised. Window boxes with the dried husks of summer flowers still in them. Not sad, I decided, more like evidence that something had bloomed here once and would again. A porch with 2 rocking chairs angled toward each other like they'd been mid-conversation when the cold came. A wood stove visible through the front window that I was going to need to address because the temperature outside was beginning to make its intentions very clear. I unloaded the car. 1 box of recording equipment I told myself I'd brought just in case. 1 bag of clothes. 1 laptop with nothing open on it. I carried them inside and set them down and stood in the middle of the small living room, and I took a breath. The cottage smelled like wood smoke and something faintly cedar, like a drawer that's held good things. The ceilings were low in the way that makes a space feel held rather than cramped. There was a quilt on the back of the couch that someone had made by hand. The stitching was uneven in places in a way that made it more beautiful, not less. I stood there in the quiet and I thought, this is it. This is where I'm going to be quiet. This is where I figure out how to stop. 22 minutes later, someone knocked on the door. I want to be honest about the first time I saw Jake Rafferty. I want to tell you what actually happened inside me in those first few seconds, without editing it into something tidier or more defensible, because the truth of it is important for what came later. He was tall in a way that wasn't aggressive about it, not performing his height, not using it, just occupying it the way a tree occupies its own space, with a kind of settled, unapologetic ease. Dark hair. Several days of stubble on a jaw that I registered as aesthetically significant before I'd made a conscious decision to register anything. Dark eyes that were doing something I can only describe as careful, not intrusive, not presumptuous, but taking me in with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who looks at things in order to actually see them. He was wearing a gray Henley, pushed up to the elbows in the cold, like a man who runs warm and considers this a reasonable arrangement with the weather. He was holding a casserole dish with a completely unself-conscious ease that I found irrationally charming. No apology for it, no acknowledgement that it was an unusual thing to show up carrying. This was the dish. The dish was here. These were simply the facts. I took all of this in over approximately 2 seconds. And then, and this is the part I didn't want, I became aware that I had taken it in, that something in me had noticed and noted and was still noting, that somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the specific dull armor I'd spent a year building, something had moved. I didn't like that information. I filed it under not why I'm here and pressed on. "You must be Nadia," he said. Low voice. Unhurried in a way that wasn't laziness, more like a man who had decided long ago that he had enough time and had never seen reason to revise that. "I'm Jake. Dorothy Briggs asked me to bring this." The dish offered toward me. "I didn't ask for food," I said. "Dorothy did," he said. "On your behalf. She also wants me to tell you that if you put it in the microwave, she'll know, and she'll be disappointed." "Does Dorothy have surveillance equipment in my rental?" Something moved in his eyes. Almost amusement. Not quite yet. "Not that I've found. She just knows things. Has for as long as I can remember." I took the dish. It was heavy and warm and smelled like something that had been made with actual time and care, both of which felt in that moment almost unbearably generous. "Thank you," I said, in the tone that means, "That's enough now. We're done here. I'll close the door gently, but I will close it." He didn't move. He looked past me into the cottage. One brief, sweeping look, and I caught it, and I recognized it even then. Not nosiness. Assessment. The look of someone cataloging a situation automatically, out of habit. I'd done enough interviews to know the difference between a person being curious and a person being careful. "Wood stove lit?" he asked. "Not yet. Temperature's dropping hard tonight, single digits by morning. I can show you how to work the damper." "I'll figure it out." He held my gaze for a moment. Something passed through it, not pushback, not offense. More like he was deciding something about me, making a small, quiet note. "Okay," he said. Not like he was backing down, like he was paying attention. "I'm right next door," he said. "House with the green shutters. 40 feet more or less. You need anything?" "I won't need anything." "Sure," he said, and turned to go. I watched him take 3 steps down the porch, and I was already half closing the door, already back inside my armor, already writing the encounter into the past tense where I could manage it properly. And then he stopped, didn't turn around. "The mailbox at the end of the road," he said. "Henderson family. They're in Florida till April." I looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, the way he was just standing there in the cooling evening, easy in his own skin, not making anything of it. "I don't know what mailbox you're referring to," I said. And there it was. The amusement, finally, quiet and real and entirely unperformed, present in his voice, like it had been waiting patiently in a back room for the right moment. "Good night, Nadia." He walked back to the house with the green shutters. I watched him go because I was standing in my own doorway and there was simply nowhere else to look. And that was the only reason, and I was absolutely not going to examine it further. Inside, I ate Dorothy's pot pie cold, standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment I wasn't ready to make, and it was extraordinary. Chicken and vegetables in a gravy that tasted like someone had put genuine love into it. I know that's a cliché. I know it. But sometimes the clichés exist because they are the most accurate available language, and this was one of those times. It tasted like care. It tasted like someone had decided, about me, a stranger, that I was worth several hours of their afternoon. I stood at the window while I ate and watched the lights come on one by one in the house with the green shutters, yellow and warm against the dark. I thought, 40 feet is very close for a neighbor. I thought about his voice, low and unhurried, and the way he'd said, okay like it was a complete sentence that contained more than it appeared to. Then I thought, I need to figure out this wood stove, and that is what I am doing tonight. That is the only thing I am doing tonight. It took 2.5 hours. It took a YouTube tutorial that I will carry to my grave with me. It took one moment, one specific, humbling moment, where I stood in front of the damper with soot on my hands and considered, genuinely considered, walking 40 feet through the cold Vermont dark and knocking on a door and admitting defeat on my first night to a man I'd told I wouldn't need anything. I did not do that. I figured it out. Laying in bed that night, I listened to the wood stove tick, a sound that was somehow both mechanical and deeply alive, and beyond it, the wind through the Vermont trees and the profound and particular silence of 3,000 people going to sleep at once, instead of a city's worth of sirens and voices and lives lived at volume. I felt the silence settle over me like a second blanket, like something I'd forgotten existed. The classroom came for me at 3 a.m, the way it always did. The small chairs, the pencils, the substitute teacher. I woke gasping, cold-cheeked, heart loud in my ears, and the dream still vivid at the edges. But when I lay there breathing, deliberately, the way Dr. Wee had taught me, counting the exhale, the silence of Hazel Creek came back in around the dream's edges, and the wood stove was still going, still ticking, a small, warm sound in the dark, and the wind in the trees was there, neutral and continuous, owing nothing to my grief. I breathed it in. I breathed it in until the dream let go of me. First night, I told myself, it will get easier. For once, in that whole terrible year, I was right about something, and I didn't even know it yet. I just lay in the dark of a cottage in Vermont with the wood stove ticking and let myself believe it might be true. Sometimes that's all you can do. Sometimes believing it might be true is the bravest thing available to you.
Jake. Dorothy Briggs called me one day before Nadia arrived. Jake, no preamble, because Dorothy considered hello a conversational expenditure with no return on investment. I've rented the cottage. Woman from New York. I need you to keep an eye on her. What does that mean exactly? It means what it means, Dorothy said. I had spent the better part of my life learning that asking Dorothy Briggs to be more specific was an exercise with a low success rate. Dorothy, does she know she's being kept an eye on? She would not welcome it, Dorothy said with the serene certainty of a woman who has been right about people for 73 years and has stopped feeling the need to defend her conclusions. Which is exactly why she needs it. She's been through something hard. She's private about it. Don't push, don't hover. Just be a neighbor. I am a neighbor, I said. I'm 40 feet away. I know where you live, she said, with the patience of someone for whom geography is simply a fact and not a point worth making. I made a chicken pot pie. You'll bring it over when she arrives. You're using me as a pot pie delivery service? I'm using the pot pie as a means of introduction. There's a difference. A brief pause. Be charming. I'm always charming. The silence that followed was one of Dorothy's finest. Compact, complete, communicating her precise opinion of that statement without expending a single word on it. It was the silence of a woman who has known you since you were in diapers and has a fully developed and not entirely flattering picture of your capacity for charm. The pot pie is in my refrigerator, she said. Come get it when her car's in the drive, and she hung up. I want to tell you about Dorothy Briggs, because she becomes essential later, and you should understand who she is before that moment arrives. 73 years old, looks 60, moves like 50, small and precise in the way of a woman who has never wasted emotion in her life. White hair cut short, eyes the specific gray of a Vermont sky that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to rain, and which has been keeping that particular decision in reserve for decades as a kind of ongoing leverage. She has lived in Hazel Creek her entire life except for 4 years at university in Burlington, and she came back because she understood, telling me once over tea with the directness she brings to everything, the difference between places that grow you and places that keep you. She knew early which kind this was. She made her peace with it before she'd finished her first year away, and she has never looked like a woman who made the wrong call. But the most important thing for you to understand about Dorothy is she knows things. She just knows things. I stopped trying to explain or rationalize this years ago, and I recommend the same approach to anyone who spends time around her. She knew my father was sick before my father told anyone, before he told me, which I have never entirely forgiven in the complicated way you don't entirely forgive things that couldn't have been helped. She knew the Henderson marriage was in serious trouble a full 3 months before it ended. She called me one Thursday evening, no context, no explanation, and said go check on Gus. And when I got there, I found him at the bottom of his basement stairs with a broken ankle he'd been quietly enduring for 2 hours because he didn't want to be a bother to anyone, which was the most Gus thing he had ever done. Ask her how she does it, and she'll tell you she just pays attention. 73 years of paying attention in a town this size. Maybe that's all it is. From the outside, it looks like something else, but I've stopped needing it to have a name. She had decided something about this woman from New York. And she had decided something about me in relation to this woman. I understood this clearly from the phone call, because I have known Dorothy Briggs my entire life, and I know what it sounds like when she has already made a decision and is simply informing you of your role in it. I went and got the pot pie. The next day, I was sitting on my porch with my second cup of coffee when the 9-year-old Subaru came down Maplebrook Road. I wasn't watching for it specifically. I was going through the materials estimate for the town hall east wall in my head, running numbers the way I do most mornings, letting the problem work itself while I drank my coffee and watched the road. But the Subaru came down at about 10 miles an hour, which is not how anyone drives on Maplebrook Road unless they're lost or looking at something, and I noticed. I watched it slow further at the Henderson place, watched it drift. The maple in that yard has been stopping people for 20 years. It's that kind of tree in October, the kind that makes you forget you're operating a vehicle. And then I heard the crack. Clean and flat and final, the Henderson mailbox meeting its end with a sound like a rifle shot. The Subaru stopped. Then, after a moment, it pulled forward and turned into the cottage drive and parked. And then it sat there. Engine off. 30 seconds, maybe 45. The specific length of time a person sits in a car when they have arrived somewhere and are not quite ready to be there yet, when they need a moment between the journey and the destination to prepare themselves for whatever comes next. She got out. Even at 40 feet, even in the October afternoon light, I could see it, the way she moved. Every motion deliberate, contained, nothing wasted. The specific quality of a person who is holding themselves together through conscious effort rather than natural ease, and who has been doing it long enough that the effort is mostly invisible. She went to the trunk. 1 box, 1 bag, a laptop, 2 trips, efficient, no wasted motion. She went inside and didn't come back out. I sat with my coffee, and I thought Dorothy was right to call me. And underneath that, quieter, with the specific quality of something I recognized but hadn't felt in a long time. Pay attention, Rafferty. This one matters. I went and got Dorothy's pot pie from my refrigerator. It smelled like something that had been made with real time and real care. The kind of food that communicates something beyond nutrition, that says someone decided you were worth this afternoon. I carried it across the 40 feet when the cottage light came on, knocked on the door, and waited. When she opened it, I understood immediately and without ambiguity why Dorothy had sent me rather than going herself. I want to tell you what I saw. Not the summary, the actual sequence, because I've turned this moment over enough times since that I know the exact order it happened in. First, the eyes, dark, direct, and immediately fully engaged. The eyes of a woman who is always in the middle of thinking something and has long since stopped apologizing for it. Not guarded exactly, more like assessed and assessing simultaneously, in the same instant, without apparent effort. Then the rest of her. Dark hair pulled back in a way that had started the day as something neat and become something more honest over the course of it. Slim in a way that wasn't her natural state. I could see the difference the way you learn to read bodies after years of physical work. The slight hollowness at the collarbone that says she's been missing meals without intending to, for a while now. Not fragile. Nothing about her red is fragile, but worn, the way good materials get worn. Still structurally sound, still everything they were, but showing the history of what they'd carried. And tired, the bone-deep tired of someone who has been fighting something internal for long enough that the fight has become the baseline, and she can no longer fully remember what it felt like before it started. She looked at me like I was a complication she was already several steps into solving. Something happened in my chest, something I'm going to describe as accurately as I can, which is a shift, low, below the level of language, in the part of me that the Army had trained and the years since had kept sharp. The specific feeling of recognition, not of a person I knew, but of something that mattered, something worth moving toward carefully, with patience, with the full attention it deserved. I did not let this show on my face. I am very good at not letting things show on my face. It's one of the more useful things the Army gave me. "I didn't ask for food," she said, flat, factual, not unkind, establishing the record. "Dorothy did," I said, "on your behalf." A slight grin on my face. I watched her look at the dish, then at me. The calculation was brief and entirely visible if you knew how to look, not rudeness, just honesty. She was deciding whether the food was worth the social cost of accepting it from a stranger on a night when she clearly wanted to be left alone more than she wanted almost anything else in the world. She decided yes, and took the dish. Smart woman, I thought, and then, before I'd chosen to think it, stubborn woman, the kind of stubborn that's really conviction, the kind that doesn't move unless there's a real reason and knows the difference between a real reason and a social obligation. I liked her. Right then, in that doorway, with the casserole dish and the cold air coming in and the October dark settling behind me. Not the careful, considered liking of a man working up to something, the immediate, uncomplicated recognition of a person worth knowing. She hadn't performed a welcome she didn't feel. She hadn't softened herself for my benefit. She'd stood in her own doorway on her first night in a new place and held her ground with the ease of a woman who has decided exactly how much of herself is available and has drawn that line with complete confidence in her own measurement. I respected it. I respected it enough to keep it short. I checked the room in the way I always check rooms. The fast automatic sweep the Army installed that I can't entirely turn off, cataloging the space without making a production of it, exits, layout, the basic facts. And what I saw beyond that, a woman who had arrived but not yet unpacked, not literally, though the single box in the corner told its own story. Something deeper. She was standing at the threshold of whatever this new chapter of her life was supposed to be, and she hadn't stepped through it yet, hadn't let herself. I gave her the out on the mailbox because she needed to save something from that first exchange, and I didn't need her to owe me anything. What I needed, what I wanted, though I wasn't going to examine that word too closely yet, was for her to feel that this place, these 40 feet, were safe, that I wasn't a demand, that I wasn't something she'd have to manage. "Good night, Nadia," I said. I turned and walked back to my house without looking back, because looking back would have been a thing she'd have noticed and filed under complications, and I had no interest in being filed under complications. Sitting on my porch in the cold with a beer that went mostly untasted, and I thought about her for longer than I'd have admitted to anyone, about the way she'd stood in that doorway, not tense, just solid. The specific solidity of a person who has learned the hard way that giving ground is expensive and has decided in advance not to do it unless the reason is worth it. About the shadows under her eyes that she was carrying with the same matter-of-fact dignity she carried everything else, like they were simply another fact about herself she'd accepted and wasn't going to make a production of. About the careful, professional distance she'd kept between herself and every moment of that brief exchange. Not coldness. Something more deliberate than that, a practiced management of proximity. Whatever she'd been through, it had been significant. The kind of significant that changes the architecture of a person, not breaks them, because she wasn't broken, but reorganizes them around a new understanding of what things cost. I thought about Gus and his simple arithmetic. Find your work, find your person, stay. I looked at the lit window of the cottage across the 40 feet of Vermont dark, and I didn't make any decisions out loud, even to myself, but something had settled in me with the quiet permanence of a thing that has found its level and is not going to move. Gus found me in the parking lot the next morning. He had a particular quality of attention sometimes, a way of reading a situation or reading me specifically that bypassed the normal channels entirely and went straight to the truth of the thing. I don't know how he did it. I stopped trying to understand it years ago and just accepted it as a Gus fact, the way you accept certain things about people you've known long enough. He took one look at my face, and he knew. "Dorothy's renter," he said. Not a question, never a question when Gus already knew the answer. "Yeah," I said. He drank his coffee, looked at the town hall building with the unhurried consideration of a man doing two things at once. Let the silence sit between us the way it could sit between men who were comfortable enough with each other not to need to fill it. "Take it slow," he said finally, "but don't be ambiguous about it." He glanced at me sideways, the Gus look, that specific combination of accuracy and amusement that I had never once successfully argued with because he was always right when he deployed it. Women who've been through the fire don't have patience for men who hedge. You're either in or you're not. She'll know the difference before you do. "I haven't done anything yet," I said. "No," he said, "but you're going to." A pause. "I know what you look like when you've decided something, Rafferty. You get quiet in a different way, like you've put something down somewhere and you know exactly where it is." I didn't argue with him. There wasn't an argument available, and we both knew it. He finished his coffee, crushed the cup. "She gonna be all right?" I thought about dark eyes and bone-deep tired and a woman holding herself together with intention and skill. "Yeah," I said. "She's going to be all right." He nodded, satisfied, like that settled it, like my saying so made it so. Which was another Gus thing, the way he trusted my assessments, the way I trusted his, completely, without requiring justification. "Good," he said, and went back to work. That night I sat on my porch in the dark and looked at the lit window of the cottage across the 40 feet and thought about patience and timing and the specific discipline required to want something and not reach for it before the ground is ready. I thought about what she'd looked like in that doorway, the eyes, the tiredness she was carrying with such complete and private dignity, the way she'd taken the dish, that small surrender, that practical decision, and what it had cost her to make it and how she'd made it anyway because she was, underneath all the careful management and the professional distance, a pragmatist. I thought, I want to know her. All of it. What she carries and why and what it felt like before she was carrying it. I want to know what she sounds like when she's not managing anything. I want to be the person she doesn't have to perform for. That last thought surprised me with how complete it was. How certain. I sat with it for a while, and I didn't talk myself out of it because it was true, and I don't talk myself out of true things. Gus was right. I decided. The deciding wasn't the hard part. The deciding had happened somewhere between the doorway and the mailbox, somewhere in the 40 feet between the cottage and my porch, in the part of me that processes things faster than language and has never once steered me wrong when I've had the sense to listen to it. The hard part, the part that required everything the Army had taught me about patience, about holding a position, about trusting your assessment and waiting for the right moment, was what came next. She needed time. She needed space. She needed to be somewhere safe, long enough to remember what safe felt like, and she needed that to happen on her own terms, without pressure, without anyone making her feel that her healing was on someone else's schedule. I could give her that. I was good at that. I'd be 40 feet away while she figured out how to be okay again. I'd be on the other side of whatever she needed to get through, and when she was ready, not when I wanted her to be ready, but when she was, I'd be exactly where she could find me. The light in her window went out at 11:17. Inside, I lay in the dark, and I thought, briefly and honestly and without apology, about a woman I had just met who had walked into a new life she wasn't sure she wanted yet, and I thought, she's going to be okay, and I'm going to be part of what makes that true. Some things you know before you can explain them. I was patient. I could wait.
Killer. Tuesday. That's when I found out she was gone. I had a Google alert on Nadia Vasquez. Had one since her episode aired. The one where she stood right at the edge of the truth and somehow didn't fall in. Every article, every mention, every whisper of her name landed on my phone. I read them all. I filed them. I told myself it was risk management, threat assessment, the careful monitoring of a variable that could, if left unwatched, become a problem. I told myself that. I'd been telling myself that for 16 months. The truth. If I was being honest with myself in the particular way that 3 in the morning sometimes demanded, was that I would have read them anyway. Every one. I would have read them the way you read about something you can't stop thinking about. Something that got under your skin in a Tuesday afternoon coffee shop and never quite came back out. She did that. My Nadia. She got under things. Most of the alerts hadn't been problems. Profile pieces about the episode's success. I read those carefully, looking for my name and also looking for her. The way she spoke about her work, the things she cared about, updates on the reopened investigation, which I monitored the way a sensible man monitors his blood pressure, and which I also monitored the way a man monitors something that would not exist without the woman who'd decided, for reasons I still turned over in quieter moments, to point her considerable attention at Claire Ashworth's death. There was a piece about Marcus Webb's cooperation with prosecutors that I read 3 times, line by line, looking for my name. It wasn't there. Marcus wouldn't give me up. We were family. I'd been telling myself that for 16 months, and so far, so good. What I didn't tell myself, what I was careful not to examine too closely, was that Marcus wasn't the one I was really watching for. Then came Tuesday, small item in a media newsletter. Almost nothing. Nadia Vasquez, host of the acclaimed podcast, What Happened Here, has taken an indefinite sabbatical to work on a book. She has relocated from Brooklyn to an unspecified location. I read it twice. Sabbatical. Relocated. Indefinite. She was gone. My Nadia had picked herself up and moved somewhere I couldn't see her, somewhere outside the careful perimeter I'd built around her life. The alerts, the articles, the compulsive cataloging of her movements through the public record. I'd had her in the way that you have something you can track and observe and measure. And now she'd stepped outside the frame. I should have been relieved. Part of me was. She wasn't working. She wasn't digging. Whatever thread she'd been pulling before she went quiet, she'd set it down. The investigation into the second person was stalled. I knew this because I had a contact at the prosecutor's office who shared information in exchange for favors I didn't examine too closely. Everyone had a price. I'd always found that clarifying. But here was the thing I kept returning to. The thing I couldn't reason away, no matter how carefully I constructed the argument. She had sat across from me in that coffee shop 3 years ago, 43 minutes, and she had looked at me with those dark eyes that recorded everything and released nothing. I had walked out with my hands sweating inside my jacket pockets, telling myself I'd held it together, telling myself she hadn't seen anything. But I'd thought about those 43 minutes more than I'd thought about almost anything else in 3 years. I'd replayed them the way you replay something that mattered, something that lodged itself in you and wouldn't dislodge. She had been extraordinary, precise and warm at the same time, the questions coming softly, almost gently, each one positioned just slightly closer than the last, like being walked towards something without realizing you were moving. I'd studied her since then, all 10 years of her work, every episode, every interview, every panel appearance where she explained, very patiently, how she thought. I told myself it was threat assessment. I told myself I was learning the enemy. But I listened to her voice for hours in the dark of my apartment, and I knew, in the honest place I tried not to visit, that threat assessment did not feel like that. She had 43 minutes of me on tape. And somewhere in those 43 minutes I had said something. I didn't know what. I'd been over every word I remembered, and nothing stood out. But I wasn't a stupid man. I knew that the things that didn't stand out to you were sometimes exactly the things that stood out to someone else. To someone who knew, with the particular precision of 10 years' practice, what she was listening for. If she went back to that tape, if she sat somewhere quiet with nothing to do but think and listen, she would find it. Whatever it was. She would find it because she was Nadia Vasquez, and finding things in the silence between words was what she did, had always done, would always do. This was her fault. I want to be precise about that. If she had left Claire Ashworth's death where it was, a closed case, a tragedy, the kind of thing that happened and was mourned and was filed away, none of this would exist. I would be in Indianapolis. I would have my business, my routine, my carefully ordinary life. I would not be sitting in my kitchen at 11 at night with a media newsletter on my phone and a feeling in my chest I didn't have a clean name for. She had chosen this. She had pointed her attention at something that didn't need her attention, and she had pulled, and she had kept pulling, and here we were, my Nadia. Brilliant, relentless, impossible Nadia Vasquez. She had done this to both of us. I needed to know where she was. It took me 4 days. I was methodical about it. No direct inquiries, no fingerprints, nothing that traced back. I moved through the edges of her professional world the way water moved around stone. A production assistant who used to work for her talked to a friend of mine at a bar. The friend mentioned Vermont, small town. She was renting somewhere quiet, writing her book, keeping to herself. Vermont. I sat with this for a week. I had a life here, a business, a routine, an ordinary existence I'd maintained for 3 years, with the discipline of a man who understood that ordinary was the finest camouflage available. I wasn't impulsive. I had done one impulsive thing in my life, and I had been managing the fallout ever since. But I kept returning to the same thought, rotating it, examining it from every angle. She was sitting somewhere quiet with nothing to do but think. And my Nadia's mind, left alone with nothing to do, was more dangerous than most people operating at full capacity. I knew this because I had spent 16 months in close, careful study of that mind. I knew how it worked. I knew what it did with silence and time. I couldn't wait for her to find it. I went to a drugstore. Black hair dye. I already had the beard, Grew it over the summer, told everyone it was a style choice, told myself something different. Gray-tinted contacts. I sat in my bathroom and changed my face, and then I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. 43 minutes, 3 years ago. Different hair, no beard, brown eyes. She wouldn't recognize me at a distance. Probably. I'd been telling myself a lot of things for 3 years. I booked a cabin outside Hazel Creek under Tom Wilder, an identity I'd built 18 months ago for exactly this kind of contingency, because I was, above all else, a man who planned for contingencies. I packed a bag, rental car, same name, everything clean. Before I got in the car, I stood in my kitchen and looked at the life I'd built. The coffee maker, the bookshelves, the photograph of my mother on the wall. And I thought about Claire Ashworth. I thought about her the way you thought about a decision that went wrong, with the specific frustration of a man who could see exactly where the error occurred and couldn't go back to correct it. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Marcus lost control, and I couldn't stop it. And by the time it was over, there was no path back to before. And then, because she had opened the case, because she had decided that Claire Ashworth's death was her story to tell, because she had sat across from me in a coffee shop with those dark, penetrating eyes and asked her careful questions and taken her 43 minutes of tape back to Brooklyn. I thought about my Nadia. I told myself I was thinking about a problem. I got in the car and drove north.
Loving how this story is unfolding? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with your favorite part so far. Nadia. Hazel Creek found me before I found it. That's the only way I can describe what happened in those first 2 weeks. Not that I went looking, but that the town simply decided, collectively and without consulting me, that I was going to be found. I hadn't come for community. Community was specifically not what I'd come for. I'd come for quiet and solitude, and the particular relief of being somewhere nobody knew my name or my work or the weight I was carrying around like a second skeleton. The plan was simple. Write the book, sleep 8 hours, heal whatever had broken in my nervous system, and leave in 3 months a functioning person. Clean, contained, manageable. Hazel Creek looked at that plan and made other arrangements. It started with Dorothy because everything in Hazel Creek started with Dorothy. Every other morning she appeared at my door with something. A scone, a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. Once an entire pot of soup she carried over from 2 doors down, like she was simply transferring it between rooms rather than delivering it to a stranger who hadn't asked. She never stayed long. She never demanded conversation or explanation or gratitude beyond a simple acknowledgement that the thing had been received. She handed me the food, exchanged a few sentences, and left, and each time I thought, I should tell her this isn't necessary. And each time, she was already walking back down the porch steps before I got there. I stopped trying to tell her. I started looking forward to it instead, which was its own quiet revelation. That I was capable of looking forward to something, that the capacity hadn't been entirely used up. The library came 3rd day. My brain wasn't ready for the book yet, wasn't ready to sit still with itself in the way that writing requires. And I'd exhausted everything I'd brought, so I walked the 6 blocks to the Hazel Creek Public Library and found Evelyn. Evelyn ran the library the way a master gardener runs a greenhouse, with complete knowledge of every living thing in it and a fierce, unsentimental affection for its continued health. 50-something, warm in the way of someone who has decided warmth is a choice worth making every single day. Reading glasses on a beaded chain. A cardigan she'd clearly owned since the early 90s and had decided was now vintage by virtue of survival. She processed my library card in under 3 minutes and then, without asking what I liked to read, recommended 4 books with the calm certainty of someone who already knew. She was right about all 4. I stopped being surprised by that after the second one. Then the farmer's market. Saturday mornings in the lot behind the general store, which functioned as the social center of Hazel Creek in a way that no single event in Brooklyn had ever managed. I went the first time out of curiosity. I bought aged cheddar from a woman named Pauline, who was 60 and magnificent, with the bearing of someone who has spent decades being exactly herself and has arrived at total peace with that project. I went back the second Saturday. And the third. By the third Saturday, Pauline had a specific wedge set aside for me under the table before I arrived, which she produced with the satisfaction of someone completing a prediction. "You're a cheddar woman," she told me. I could tell the first time. "What does that mean?" She looked at me with the serene patience of someone for whom this was obvious. "Strong flavor. No interest in mild." I bought 3 wedges and walked home thinking about that for longer than was probably warranted. Whether she was right. Whether I used to be and had simply forgotten. Whether the last year had made me something blander without my noticing. Phil Sorrento at the cidery pressed a bottle on me the first visit, overriding my protest with the gentle authority of a man for whom generosity had long since become structural rather than occasional. Helen Chen, chair of the Historical Preservation Board, ambushed me outside the post office to brief me on the town hall crown molding situation with the passionate specificity of someone who had been waiting for a fresh audience and was so genuinely committed to the subject that I found myself caring about crown molding, which was not something I had previously believed possible. Ted Marsh, the town selectman, waved at me from his car every single day, every single time he drove past, and by the third day, I was waving back because it had started to feel unkind not to. One by one, without pressure or performance, the town was filling in around me like water finding its level. And then there was Jake. Jake, who knocked on my door Tuesday evening, holding a bottle of cider and offering what he characterized as a surplus situation requiring resolution. "You bought 1 bottle," I said, looking at the single bottle in his hand. "I miscalculated my need," he said. "That's not how math works." It was a complicated week. I stood in the doorway looking at him. At the easy way he was standing there, unhurried, no agenda visible on his face. Just a man with a bottle of cider and a questionable story. And I felt something I hadn't felt in recent memory, which was the specific pull of wanting to let someone in. Not the social obligation of it, not the performance of normalcy, the actual want. I told myself I was curious about the cider. The cider was very good, but that wasn't why I stepped back and opened the door wider, and some honest part of me knew it even then. And I chose not to examine it too closely because I wasn't sure I was ready for what the examination might find. We sat on the porch in the cooling dark. We talked about the town, about his work, about what Vermont became in December, which he described with the affection of someone who has genuinely made peace with difficult seasons rather than simply enduring them. He asked about my writing, and when I was vague about it, he didn't push. Just accepted the vagueness and moved on, which is rarer than it should be, and which I noticed. He told me about his father and the business with a matter-of-fact directness that wasn't looking for sympathy, just stating things he'd accepted, and I found myself listening the way I listened to people I respected, with my whole attention and not just cataloging. I was comfortable. I want to stay with that for a moment because it surprised me when I registered it, sitting there in the dark with the cider and the sound of the creek below us. Comfortable. With a person I'd known for a week, a person who was, and I was aware of this, had been aware of it since the doorway, since the first evening with the casserole dish, had been carefully not being aware of it. A person who was, in straightforward physical terms, quite difficult to sit across from without noticing that you were sitting across from him, not because he was trying to be. That was the thing. He wasn't performing anything. He sat in the other rocking chair with his long legs stretched in front of him, and his hands wrapped around his cider like it was a warm thing worth holding, and he was just there, present, occupying his own space without any apparent anxiety about it, and somehow that ease, that absence of performance, was more affecting than anything deliberate could have been. I thought about Pauline's cheddar assessment. Strong flavor, no interest in mild. I looked at the line of his jaw in the low porch light and thought that was probably also true about what I noticed in other people. Then I looked away because I was not here for this. I was here to heal, and some repairs require keeping the worksite clear of additional complications. It was habit, not intention, that made me look down the road. A decade of crime reporting does something to your nervous system. It installs a kind of background process, always running, mostly silent, that monitors sightlines and catalogs anomalies and flags things that don't quite fit. I don't always know I'm doing it. I was mid-sentence, or perhaps mid-listening, and my eyes moved to the far end of Maple Brook Road the way they always eventually move to exits, to peripheries, to the edges of any space I was in. He was at the far end of the road, where it curved toward the covered bridge. Dark hair, a beard, a jacket and camera bag, standing in the fading light looking at the trees. A tourist. A man with a camera in October in Vermont. The most unremarkable thing you could possibly be in this place at this time of year. My eyes found him and found nothing objectively alarming. Just a man. Just a camera. Just the trees. But something moved in the back of my brain. Not a sound. Not an image. A movement. Like a drawer sliding open an inch and then catching on something, stopping short of whatever was inside. I looked away. I looked back. He was gone. "You okay?" Jake asked. His voice was quiet. He was watching me with that careful attention that I'd noticed before and hadn't fully decided what to do with. The kind of attention that doesn't perform concern, but simply directs itself, steadily, at the thing that matters. "Yes," I said. "Sorry, habit. I'm always checking sightlines." "Why?" Not suspicious. Genuinely curious. Like it was a fact about me worth understanding. 10 years of being in places where things had gone wrong, I said. You start reading spaces. It becomes automatic. He nodded slowly, turned it over. "Me too," he said quietly, in a tone that wasn't looking for acknowledgement, just placing itself alongside what I'd said. "Me too." The army, I remembered. Whatever he'd seen there. Whatever it had recalibrated in him. Something in me shifted slightly toward him in that moment. Not a physical movement. Internal, small. The specific shift of recognizing something of yourself in another person and feeling, despite your best intentions, a little less alone because of it. We drank the rest of the cider. The dark came down around us properly, the Vermont dark that has real weight to it, that presses in from the edges of the tree line like it means it. Neither of us rushed. Neither of us manufactured an exit. And I was aware, in a way I couldn't quite suppress, of the quality of the silence between us. That it was easy. That it required nothing. That I was sitting in it without the specific low-grade effort that sitting in silence with most people costs me. When he finally said goodnight and walked back across the 40 feet to his house with the green shutters, I stayed in the rocking chair and watched him go without pretending I wasn't watching. The porch light caught his shoulders, the unhurried set of them, and then he was inside and the light was on in his kitchen window, and I could see the vague movement of him through the glass, and I thought, briefly and against my will, 40 feet is very close for a neighbor. I sat there for another 10 minutes, listening to the creek and the wind in the trees, and did not think about the classroom once. What I thought about instead was the man at the end of the road. The drawer, open that one stubborn inch. The thing behind it still in shadow, still unresolved, still sending that low signal I couldn't name or dismiss. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was a woman whose nervous system had spent a decade in proximity to real threat and had recalibrated accordingly, that I was conditioned to see danger in ordinary things, that a man with a camera in Vermont was just a man with a camera in Vermont, and the part of me that had flagged him was the same part that still dreamed about classrooms and couldn't sleep past 3 a.m. I told myself all of that with conviction. I almost believed it. But I sat on the porch a little longer than I'd meant to, watching the dark at the end of the road where the curve bent toward the bridge, watching the place where he'd been. And I thought about instincts, about the ones I'd learned to trust, and the one time I hadn't. The night air was cold and still. The creek moved over the rocks below. Somewhere in the house with the green shutters, a light went out.
Killer. The cabin was 12 miles outside Hazel Creek, up a fire road that turned to mud in wet weather. I'd chosen it deliberately. Distance, seclusion, cash payment accepted. The owner was an older man who didn't ask questions, which was either trustfulness or incuriosity, and in either case was useful. I'd stood in the gravel drive and looked at the tree line and thought, yes, this would do. Close enough to her. I spent the first 3 days watching the town. Not her specifically. Not yet. The town. I needed to understand the geography, the rhythms, the patterns. Who went where and when. Which roads were traveled and which weren't. Where the gaps were. I was methodical about it. The way I was methodical about everything. And I told myself this was simply reconnaissance. Preparation. The careful work of a careful man. I told myself that while I memorized the street she walked down every morning, I was a methodical man. I always had been. It was what made me good at my work, property management, the careful tracking of details, the patience for the long view. You didn't manage 37 rental units without developing systems. You didn't manage 37 rental units and the relationships and transactions that came with them without understanding that most problems could be anticipated if you were paying enough attention. I should have anticipated Nadia Vasquez. I'd admitted this to myself. I should have seen her coming. Not just the podcast, not just the investigation, but her specifically. The quality of her attention, the particular shape of her intelligence, the way she moved through the world like a woman who understood that the truth was always there if you were willing to be patient with it. I'd watched enough of her work to know she was different from the others who'd looked at the case. Most journalists, even good ones, move through an investigation looking for what they expected to find. She moved through looking for what didn't fit. There was a difference. It was the difference that had brought me 600 miles north and put me on a fire road in Vermont. She had done this. I came back to that often. In those first days in the cabin, in the particular silence of the Vermont woods that gave thoughts too much room to move around in. She had done this to us. To me. If she had left Claire Ashworth where she was, a closed case, a tragedy filed and forgotten the way tragedies were supposed to be, I would be in Indianapolis right now. I would be ordinary. I would be safe. Instead, I was here, 12 miles up a fire road, because my Nadia couldn't leave things alone. I was here because I'd underestimated her once. I wouldn't do it again. On the 4th day, I drove into Hazel Creek. The town was small enough that a new face registered. I knew this. So I'd built a story. Leaf peeper from Connecticut. Taking some time after a difficult year. Enjoying the scenery. I had the camera bag as a prop. I stopped at Birch and Grounds and bought a coffee and sat at a window table and opened a book and watched the street. I was, I believed, completely unremarkable. A tourist, a man at a table with a book and a coffee. I saw her at 9:47 in the morning. She came out of the library with 3 books and a to-go cup from the coffee shop, and she walked up the sidewalk with the brisk efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be and had no patience for not being there. Dark jacket, hair up. She looked different from my memory of her. Lighter somehow, like something she'd been carrying had been partially set down. Like Vermont was doing something for her that Brooklyn hadn't been able to. I watched her over the edge of my book, and I felt my pulse do something it had no business doing. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. I'd known this from photographs, from footage, from the way cameras found her face and stayed there. But photographs hadn't prepared me for the specific quality of her in motion. The way she moved through space with that particular focused energy. The way she pushed a strand of hair back from her face without breaking stride. I had spent 16 months with her voice in my ears and her name in my alerts, and I had somehow still underestimated what it would feel like to see her. She was real. She was 20 feet away, She was mine in the sense that I had crossed 600 miles of this country to be in proximity to her, had built a false identity and changed my face and rearranged my entire life around the fact of her existence. And she had absolutely no idea I was there. I made myself breathe through it. She didn't look in my direction. I watched until she turned the corner onto Maplebrook Road and disappeared. Then I picked up my coffee and sat very still for a moment and thought about the fact that she had done this, that she had put herself here in my sightlines by refusing to leave a dead woman's case alone. She had pulled on the thread, and the thread had led here, to this coffee shop, to me sitting at this window watching her walk away and feeling things I hadn't planned for. Her fault, all of it. I held on to that. She hadn't seen me, I was certain. The distance was 20 feet and the disguise was good. I tested it, examined myself from every angle at various distances, thought carefully about what she would be looking for, if she was looking. I didn't look like the man she'd interviewed. I didn't look like anyone she would have had a reason to notice. Good. I needed her not to notice me. Not yet. I needed a way to get close to her work. Not to her, to her archive. She recorded everything, I knew this. It was her professional religion, documented obsessively in every profile I'd read, voice memos, digital recordings in a structured archive, backed up in 2 places, always because she'd learned early that recorded interviews were the bedrock of everything else. She had 43 minutes of me somewhere in that archive. I'd thought about those 43 minutes more than I'd thought about almost anything else. I'd reconstructed them from memory so many times they'd started to feel like something I could hold, turn over, examine. Every question she'd asked, every answer I'd given, the way she'd tilted her head when something interested her, the way she'd let silences run a beat longer than was comfortable, the way she'd looked at me across the table with those dark eyes that gave nothing back. I needed to hear what she'd heard. I needed to sit with those 43 minutes and find whatever it was she might find before she found it. And if there was something there, if I heard it and knew it was enough, I needed to make sure she never got the chance to act on it. I drove back to the cabin on the fire road. I would be careful, methodical, unhurried. I had time. She hadn't gone back to the archive yet. Nothing was moving. No calls to prosecutors. No detectives suddenly re-engaged. She was writing her book and walking her street and going to her library and being lighter than she'd been in Brooklyn. She was, in some corner of myself I didn't examine, blooming a little, in spite of everything, in spite of what she'd done to both of us by refusing to leave things buried. I sat at the cabin window and looked at the dark Vermont trees and thought about being patient, which was something I was good at, and I thought about my Nadia, 20 feet away on a sidewalk, pushing her hair back from her face without breaking stride. And I thought briefly about Claire Ashworth, which I couldn't help. She had brown eyes. I remembered that. Brown eyes and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she expected better from you.
Jake, I want to tell you about the Harvest Festival before I tell you what I saw there, because the festival matters and I don't want you to miss it. Hazel Creek puts its whole heart into this one day every year with the specific generosity of a town that knows what it has and wants to share it. And the result is something that has to be experienced to be fully understood. The town green gets taken over for a full Saturday in mid-October. Vendor tents and the smell of kettle corn and wood smoke and something sweet underneath, that's just the air itself. The leaves at peak color because the festival committee has been scheduling around the peak for 30 years, and they know exactly what they're doing. Russell Fitch plays fiddle on the stage, 60 years old, looks 70, plays like someone who made a private agreement with music a long time ago and has been honoring it ever since. I've heard him my entire life, and I still stop what I'm doing when he starts. There's apple pressing and pie judging and Bill Hutchins' cast iron kettle producing kettle corn that should not technically be as extraordinary as it is, and Bill has been doing it since 1987 and shows no signs of explaining his method to anyone. It's the kind of day that reminds you why you stayed, why the leaving never made permanent sense. I'd been looking forward to this one differently than I'd looked forward to any of the previous ones. Because Nadia was here now. Because I'd spent 2 weeks watching her from 40 feet and from closer when she'd let me closer, and I'd seen something happening. Gradual, careful, the specific process of a person beginning to remember what it felt like before they were carrying so much. The tension in her shoulders easing in increments, the professional distance she kept from every room, every moment, softening at the edges. The way she'd started to eat Dorothy's food like someone who actually tasted it, rather than someone fueling a machine. I thought the festival might be the thing that finished what the town had started. Sometimes a place that's working on someone just needs one concentrated dose. I was right about that, and I was wrong about everything else. She showed up at 10:15, which I'd expected, early enough to not seem eager, late enough to have deliberated about it, which told me she'd wanted to come, and had given herself a hard time about wanting to. I found her at the kettle corn first, which was the correct opening move and told me something useful about her that I filed away with everything else I'd been filing. She went toward the thing that smelled best without overthinking it. Underneath all the careful management, there was a woman who trusted her instincts when she let herself. We fell into orbit the way we'd been falling into orbit for 2 weeks, circling without fully landing, close without closing the distance, both of us aware of the space between us and neither of us quite ready to say so out loud. I was patient about it. I had decided to be patient about it, but I want to be honest. It was getting harder. Every day she was here, every conversation on the porch, and every time she laughed at something and then looked briefly surprised that she'd laughed. It was getting harder to be as patient as the situation required. She was lighter at the festival. That's the word. Lighter. Something genuine was happening in her face. The guardedness down in a way I hadn't seen it down before. And at the pie judging table she laughed twice. The real laugh, not the controlled, considered version she deployed in polite conversation, but the one that came from somewhere lower and surprised her both times it arrived. The one she tried to pull back slightly, the way she always did with things that felt too unguarded. I wanted to keep producing it. I noted, with the specific attention I'd been paying to her since the first evening, that I wanted that more than I'd wanted most things in recent memory. The sound of her actually laughing, the way it changed her whole face, the brief undefended openness of it before she collected herself. I gave the rhubarb pie a 9. She gave it a 6.5 with the serenity of someone who has made her assessment and has no interest in defending it. Barbara Hutchins has been making that pie for 22 years, I told her. Then she's had 22 years to figure out the filling, she said, and moved on to the maple cream without a backward glance. She ate 3 slices of the maple cream. I noticed this without making anything of it in the moment, but I noted it. She'd been eating like someone who kept forgetting food was an option, and 3 slices of pie was progress. Small, specific, real progress. I thought, she's going to be okay. She's already starting to be okay. Then I saw him, dark hair, close beard, camera bag over one shoulder, standing at the far eastern edge of the green, near the road, with a paper cup of cider he wasn't drinking. I clocked him the way I clock everyone in a space. Automatic, military, the habit that never fully deactivated no matter how many Vermont Octobers passed over it. Fast assessment. Male, roughly 40, medium build, nobody I recognized. Camera bag, cider, standing slightly apart from the main flow of the crowd. I filed him as tourist and moved on. 3 minutes later, something made me look back. I've learned over the course of my life to respect those small delays. It's the time it takes for the conscious mind to catch up with what the instincts already know. The thing that makes you look back isn't a thought. It's something older than thought, something that operates in the part of you that was built for survival before language existed. I've trusted it in worse situations than an October festival in Vermont, and it has not been wrong. I looked back, and I watched him with the specific, unfocused focus of a man who has been trained to observe without appearing to observe. Looking at Russell on the stage, apparently my attention on nothing in particular, while my peripheral vision did the actual work. He wasn't looking at the fiddle player. He wasn't looking at the apple pressing or the kettle corn or the children running between the tents with their pumpkins. He was looking at a specific sector of the green with the kind of fixed, patient attention that has nothing to do with enjoying a festival. I tracked his sightline. It ended at Nadia. Something cold moved through me, not panic. I don't panic. That's not how I'm built. Something colder and more functional than panic. The specific internal shift of a situation reclassifying itself from normal to not normal, and everything that follows from that reclassification happening in sequence automatically, the way it was trained to happen. I watched him for 10 minutes without appearing to watch him. He moved twice, once to the cider vendor, once to a different position near the road. And both times his new position maintained the same precise relationship to where Nadia was in the crowd. He was tracking her without approaching her, using the crowd as concealment without being in the crowd, staying at the distance that made him unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. I was specifically looking. I knew what I was seeing. I have seen it before, in other contexts, in other places, and the fundamental geometry of it doesn't change based on location. That is surveillance. Patient, practiced, deliberate surveillance. The behavior of a person who has done this before and knows how to do it without being noticed. I didn't say anything to Nadia. Not then. She'd had the first genuinely easy morning I'd watched her have since she arrived. The guardedness down, the laugh real, 3 slices of pie. She was here, actually here, in this day, in a way she hadn't been in any of the days before it, and I wasn't going to pull her out of that on a read I couldn't yet verify. I'm good at reading situations. I have a strong record. But I'm not infallible, and the cost of being wrong here, of taking this morning from her, of putting the fear back in those eyes before I was certain there was something to fear, was too high. So I stayed present. I laughed at appropriate moments. I bought kettle corn and argued mildly about pie scores and watched Russell play and kept Nadia in my sight and the dark-haired man in my peripheral vision simultaneously. Which is a skill I used on active duty in Afghanistan, and which is not a skill I ever expected to need in Hazel Creek, Vermont. When the man left, slipped out of the festival the way he'd arrived, quietly, without drawing attention, making his exit look like nothing because he'd practiced making things look like nothing, I cataloged everything I had on him. Height, build, hair color, the specific dark jacket, the camera bag that over the course of nearly 40 minutes he had never once used to take a photograph. The way he walked with his weight slightly favoring his right side, the kind of compensation that says old injury, healed, but never entirely. I stored all of it. That evening I walked Nadia home from the festival. This happened the way most things between us happened. Not planned, not discussed, just the natural physics of two people who had spent enough time in orbit around each other that moving together had become easier than moving apart. We walked down Main Street in the October dark, and the town was winding down around us, and she was still lighter than she'd been, still carrying some of the ease the day had given her, and I was glad of it and afraid for it in equal measure. On her porch, she looked at me in the dark, and something shifted in the air between us. That thing that had been shifting incrementally for 2 weeks, that I'd been patient about, that I was finding required more patience each day. "Jake," she said. "Nadia," I said. The space between us was doing what it had been doing, getting smaller, without either of us deciding to make it smaller, the specific gravity of two people who have stopped pretending they aren't aware of each other's exact position at all times. I was ready. I had been ready. Some part of me had been ready since the doorway and the casserole dish, and the way she'd looked at me like a complication she was solving. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something came down over her face. Not the guardedness, something different, something more complicated. "My producer," she said. "Take it," I said, because it was clearly not optional and because I could see from the quality of the complicated thing on her face that this was not a call she could let go to voicemail. "I'll see you tomorrow." She answered it walking inside, and the door closed, and I stood on her porch alone in the Vermont dark, and I let the moment go. I stood on that porch for a while, and I thought about what I'd seen at the festival, about the way he'd moved to maintain his position relative to her, about a camera bag that never produced a camera, about a woman who had spent a decade putting dangerous people in documented, public, named places, people who knew her name, who had reason to remember it, who had every reason to know where she'd gone when she left Brooklyn. About the fact that she was here to be quiet, to heal, to be somewhere nobody knew her name, but somebody had found her. The cold thing moved through me again, colder this time, more specific, because this wasn't a red I was second-guessing anymore. 2 sightings, same behavior, same position relative to the same target. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns mean intention. And intention means I needed to start thinking about this the way I'd been trained to think about threats, which was seriously, immediately, and without the comfort of assuming the best. At home, I sat on my own porch with a beer that went warm in my hand, and I thought about patience and timing and all the things I'd been turning over for 2 weeks. And I thought about how the calculation had just changed. The question wasn't whether something was wrong. Something was wrong. I was certain of that now, with the unpleasant certainty of a man who has assessed enough situations to know when his assessment is correct and who takes no pleasure in being right about this particular thing. The question was what, and who, and how much time I had before it moved from observation to something else. I thought about Nadia inside the cottage, on the phone with her producer, in the warm light behind the curtained window. The ease she'd had today, the real laugh, the 3 slices of pie, the careful, patient, real work she was doing on herself day by day in this town that was working on her the way I'd believed it would. I thought about someone watching that, tracking it, mapping her patterns. Something moved in me that was not cold, something that had nothing to do with military training or situational assessment or the careful, patient discipline I'd been practicing for 2 weeks. It was older than all of that, simpler, more absolute, not her. Whatever this was, whoever this was, they were not going to get to her. Not while I was 40 feet away with 5 years of this town in my bones and 8 years of the Army before that, and the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a man who has decided what matters and is prepared to act accordingly. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on the porch until well past midnight in the cold, watching the road. Just in case.
Nadia. Scott called on a Wednesday morning while I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to write. My producer. 6 years, which in podcast terms is something like a geological era. He is the best person I know at his job, and he worries about me with a precision I find alternately moving and suffocating. The kind of worry that doesn't announce itself but is simply always present, calibrated, watching for the specific signals that mean something is wrong. In the week after the Ashworth episode aired, when I was holding myself together with the professional equivalent of wire and good posture, he had said, "You sound wrong. Not wrong like sick, wrong like something happened to you and you're not going to tell me, but I'm going to worry anyway." He had not been incorrect. The Ashworth family wanted to talk. Claire's mother and sister. They'd reached out through the podcast's contact page, very gently, Scott said, very specifically. Not for recording. Not for the show, just to talk. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "Take your time." He said the new investigation was moving slowly and that there was speculation in media circles about whether I was coming back to it. I told him I was writing a book. He said he knew. He said whatever I needed, and he meant it. And I had to set the phone down after we hung up and sit with the specific, complicated weight of being known by someone who doesn't require anything from you. I thought about the Ashworth family for 2 days. About Claire's mother, who I had never spoken to. I'd talked to the sister early in the investigation, briefly, but the mother had been too fragile and I hadn't pushed, which was its own kind of guilt to carry. I thought about what it meant that they'd reached out now, what they might want to say, whether I was ready to go back there, even adjacent. I didn't decide. I let it sit the way Dr. Wee had taught me. Don't force, don't avoid. Let the thing occupy the space it needs until the answer becomes clear on its own. What clarified in those 2 days was not the Ashworth decision. It was something else entirely. Evelyn had mentioned the town meeting at the library. First Thursday of every month, elementary school gymnasium, very democratic, bring your own coffee. I'd filed it under things I will not be attending and moved on. I was here for solitude. Civic participation was a different category entirely. Jake knocked on my door at 6:30. "Town meeting," he said, like he was simply announcing a fact about the universe that I might have missed. I wasn't planning to go. "I know." He looked at me with that particular patience of his, the kind that doesn't push but simply waits on the other side of the obvious next thing. "Come anyway." I stood in my doorway and looked at him. He was wearing a dark jacket, a little bit of sawdust on his sleeve that he either hadn't noticed or had decided wasn't worth addressing, and he was looking back at me with an expression that was not a challenge, not a request, more like an invitation that was confident enough in itself not to require my immediate answer. Something shifted in my chest. Something inconveniently located and imprecisely named. I got my coat. I have been in a lot of rooms in my professional life. Courtrooms and press conferences and police briefings and community meetings in cities where something terrible had happened and people needed somewhere to direct the feeling of it. I know how to read a room from the doorway. I know within 30 seconds what kind of space I'm walking into. The Hazel Creek Elementary School gymnasium was unlike any room I'd ever been in. 40 people, maybe, in folding chairs on a scuffed wood floor under fluorescent lights. And they were invested. Not performing investment, not going through the motions of civic participation, actually in it with each other, with the business of this place they shared. The dog park debate, which had apparently been ongoing for 3 months, and which I had zero context for, generated more authentic democratic feeling than most city council meetings I'd attended in my professional life. Helen Chen made her crown molding case with footnoted precision, and sat down radiating the satisfaction of someone who has discharged a serious duty and discharged it well. And then Jake went to the podium. I watched him the way I watched everyone in rooms, cataloging, professional. And then I stopped cataloging because cataloging required a certain distance, and distance was getting harder to maintain. He spoke with the ease of a man who has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to perform. He was funny without trying to be, which is the only way to actually be funny. He handled Helen's follow-up challenges with a patience that was clearly genuine, not managed, not effortful, just real. And when he came back and sat down next to me, I was aware of the specific fact of him settling into the chair beside mine, the warmth he gave off, the way the sleeve of his jacket almost touched my arm and didn't. The gymnasium smelled like old wood floors and coffee and something that was just him underneath all of it. Sawdust and cold air and something warmer beneath that I was not going to name. "She's not satisfied," I murmured, watching Helen, who was consulting her notes with the expression of someone preparing a follow-up. "She's never satisfied," he murmured back. Close enough that I felt more than heard it. It's her superpower. I kept my eyes on Helen. I was smiling, and I let myself, and I didn't examine it. After, in the milling about that follows small-town events, Dorothy materialized at my elbow with the precision of a woman who had been positioned for exactly this moment and had been patient about it. "What did you think?" she asked. "I think this town loves itself," I said. "In the good way. In the way that's actually rare." She smiled. Not the usual smile. The one that was warm but also slightly strategic, slightly knowing. A real one, open and quiet. "It does," she said. "It took a long time to learn how. Most things worth loving take learning." She glanced across the room to where Jake was talking with Phil Sorrento, the ease of two men who have been friends long enough to not need to try. Then she looked back at me. "He built this," she said. "Not the buildings, the feeling of it. When his father died, Jake could have sold everything and gone back to whatever the army had for him. Instead, he stayed. He put his whole self into this place. That does something to a town, to the people in it." "Dorothy," I said. "I'm just talking," she said, with the serenity of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. "Go have a good evening." He walked me home, down Main Street and left onto Maplebrook Road, under a sky that was doing what the Vermont sky does when there's no light pollution and no restraint. Just wall-to-wall stars, extravagant, slightly absurd in their abundance, like someone had been given a commission and taken it too seriously. I don't see stars in Brooklyn. I forget they exist. I forget that the sky has a bottom layer beneath the glow, that it goes back and back, that there is that much of it. I looked up and felt something loosen in my chest, the way things had been loosening incrementally since I arrived here. Since Dorothy's soup, since Pauline's cheddar, since a man with a casserole dish and an undefended face and a voice that didn't need to compete for anything. We stopped at my porch. The light above the door made a small warm circle in the dark. "Thank you for making me go," I said. "I didn't make you." "You didn't ask either," I said. "You just said come anyway. That's different from asking." He considered this with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. "Is it better or worse?" I looked at him. The porch light caught the line of his jaw, the dark of his eyes, The particular quality of his stillness. The kind that isn't absence, but presence. The kind that says, I am here and I am not going anywhere. Something in my chest had been tightening for the last hour and a half, and I was only now acknowledging it. Honestly, better. I held his gaze. I haven't been made to do anything in a while. I've been permitted to opt out. By everyone who loves me, because they were worried, and the opting out started to feel like the only available option, like I'd forgotten there was another kind. He was quiet, looking at me with that quality of attention that I'd been trying for 2 weeks to find a way to be indifferent to. Not through me, not past me, at me, with the specific intentional quality of a person for whom looking is not passive. Nadia, he said, low. Something in the register of it that was different from every other time he'd said my name, and he'd said it enough times now that I knew the difference. Jake, I said. The space between us had been closing for 2 weeks in increments so small I could deny each one individually. Whatever increments remained were now very few. I was aware of my own heartbeat with an inconvenient specificity. I was aware of his hands, one resting on the porch rail, close enough to mine that the cold air between them felt like a thing with edges. My feet made a decision my brain hadn't quite ratified yet. I stepped up onto the first porch step, which brought us to eye level, which put my face 6 inches from his, which was, well, there we were. He didn't move. He waited the way he waited, not passively, not with absence, but with that deep, intentional patience of a person who has decided something and is willing to let it arrive in its own time. I put my hand on his jaw, just put it there, the stubble rough against my palm, and he was warm, surprisingly warm against the cold night, and I felt him go still the way he went still when something had all of his attention. His eyes stayed on mine, close now, and they were doing the thing they did, that careful, unguarded thing, and I thought with some last functioning rational part of my brain, I am in serious trouble here. I'm not easy about this, I said. I know. No hedging, no reassurance. Just acknowledgement, clean and direct. I have a lot of, I searched. Ongoing construction. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, warmer than that. I know that too. And you're not bothered. No, he said. Absolutely simple. Absolutely certain. In the way that he was certain about things, without performance or caveat, and God help me, but it was that certainty, that uncomplicated no, that finished whatever the last 2 weeks had been building toward. I kissed him. Soft, first. Just the test of it. Just to know what it was, this thing I'd been not examining for 2 weeks. And what it was warm and unhurried and nothing like the careful, managed experiences I'd allowed myself in recent years, the ones where some part of me was always watching from slightly outside my own body, cataloging, maintaining the distance. I was not at a distance. I was entirely inside this. His hand came up and covered mine, where it rested on his jaw, and he kissed me back, and then he pulled back just enough to look at me. That look, the one with no category for it, something between certain and undone. And the Vermont night was cold around us, and the stars were extravagant overhead, and I thought, with something that felt like relief more than anything else, oh, there it is. There's the thing. Come inside, I said. I have cider left. He came inside. I want to tell you about that night because it matters. It matters to everything that came after. But not in the way you might expect. Nothing happened that night except talking and sitting, and the specific slow alchemy of 2 people deciding, without saying so, that they trust each other. That sounds simple. It was the furthest thing from simple. For me, in that year, in that state, it was the most significant thing that had happened in a very long time. I poured the cider. He settled onto one end of the couch with the ease of a man who doesn't require an invitation to be comfortable, and I sat on the other end with my legs tucked under me and my glass in both hands. And we talked. Really talked. The kind that starts with small things and finds its way, without rushing, to the real ones. He told me about the Army. Not the version you give people at parties, the edited highlights, but the actual version, the parts that had left marks. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, directly, without drama, letting the weight of it rest where it actually rested, rather than performing something tidier. I listened the way I listen when something matters, with my whole attention, and I heard underneath the things he said the shape of the things he wasn't saying yet, and I didn't push, just listened. And then, because he had given me something real, I gave him something real back. I told him about the case, the private version, not the podcast, not the professional narrative I'd constructed and delivered 14 million times in my head. I told him about the interviews and the notes and hours or research, going over and over again what had happened to Claire. I told him what it had been like to pull out Claire's photographs and look at them again and again. I told him about the bathroom floor at 2 a.m, the kind of crying that surprises you with how much has been waiting. He didn't try to fix it, didn't reframe, didn't solve, didn't offer the subtle performance of sympathy that people produce when they're uncomfortable with pain and need to move it somewhere more manageable. He just held it, sat with me while I held it, his eyes on mine, steady, present, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like, to say the true thing and have someone stay. At some point, the conversation went quiet in the way that comfortable silences do, not empty, just resting. The wood stove was ticking. The cider was gone. I was aware, distantly, that it was very late, and I was aware, less distantly, that I didn't want him to leave. I wasn't ready to look at that directly, but I was aware of it. What I was also aware of, had been aware of all evening in the way you're aware of something you've decided not to examine, was how close we were. The couch wasn't large. We'd migrated toward the middle of it the way people do without noticing, and at some point his arm had come to rest along the back of it behind me, not touching, just there. An offer, a presence. I leaned back into it. He didn't make anything of it. Didn't shift, didn't comment, didn't adjust. Just let it be what it was. Me, deciding something small, and him, receiving it without making it a transaction. I am telling you this because it sounds like nothing, and it was not nothing. I had spent a year keeping a careful, necessary distance from everything because getting close to things meant feeling them, and feeling things meant consequences I didn't have the bandwidth for. Leaning back into his arm on that couch was, for me in that year, a thing that cost something, a thing I chose anyway. That's what I hadn't known I was missing. Not warmth exactly, not company exactly. This, the specific feeling of being all the way present with another person and choosing to stay there. Not managing it. Not watching from slightly outside. Just being in it. In the room. In the quiet. In the particular gravity of two people sitting close in the dark. We fell asleep there. I don't know exactly when. The conversation just slowed and then stopped, and the wood stove ticked. And at some point I became aware that his breathing had gone deep and even, and that my head was resting against his shoulder, and that I was not going to move, and I didn't. I thought, in the last moment before I went under, oh, quietly. Oh, this is it. I meant the quiet. I meant the warmth. I meant the sound of his breathing, and the specific weight of his shoulder, and the way the cottage felt different with him in it. Fuller somehow, like a room coming into focus. I meant him. I was beginning to understand that I meant him, and that this was going to be one of those things I couldn't unknow. The classroom came briefly and went, the way it had been going lately, visiting instead of staying, losing some of its grip. And when I woke in the gray early morning, the room was cold and pale, and he was still there. Still there. I looked at him for a moment before he knew I was awake. The morning light on his face, unguarded in sleep, the dark of his lashes against his cheek. Something in me reached toward him with a tenderness so uncomplicated that it frightened me a little, because tenderness like that doesn't stay small. Tenderness like that wants something. "Good morning," he said without opening his eyes. "Good morning," I said. He made coffee. He found everything in my kitchen without being shown, and I sat at the table and watched him move through the space and thought about how strange it was, how unprecedented to want someone in your kitchen. To want the domesticity of it, the ordinary specific weight of a person who fits. We sat at the table and talked about nothing and everything, and the light came gold through the window, and I wrapped both hands around my mug, and I thought, clearly without panic, without the usual retreat. I could stay here. Not just in this cottage, not just in this town, here, in this time, whatever this is becoming. I held the thought. I let it be there.
Killer. I'd been in Hazel Creek for 2 weeks when I saw them together for the first time. Birch and grounds had become my morning routine, unremarkable, consistent, a tourist who liked the coffee. I came in at 8, took my table by the window. Nobody bothered me. The woman who ran the shop, young, efficient, barely looked up, knew my order by then. A regular. A regular was invisible. And invisibility had its advantages. From my table by the window, I could watch the street, watch the corner of Maplebrook Road, watch the particular stretch of sidewalk where my Nadia appeared most mornings with her coffee and her books and that brisk, purposeful walk that I had memorized the way you memorized music. Not deliberately, but because you'd heard it enough times that it simply lived in you now. 8:20. She was almost always there by 8:20. She came in at 8:20 with a man. I knew the man. Of course I knew him. I'd cataloged everyone within her orbit, mapped every relationship, assessed every variable. Jake Rafferty, contractor, local, next-door neighbor of Nadia's rental. I'd been watching Rafferty for 2 weeks with the careful, dispassionate attention I gave to anything that existed in proximity to her. And my assessment had been civilian, strong. Yes, observant, probably more than average. But a local contractor in a small Vermont town. Not a problem. Not someone who belonged in her story. They came through the door together in the easy way of people who had been spending time together. That specific looseness of bearing that came from someone else's proximity, from being in a space that smelled like another person, from the particular comfort of a body that had become familiar. She was laughing at something he'd said, not the contained, professional laugh I'd cataloged from her street, a real one. Head tilting back, throat exposed, her guard not merely lowered, but entirely carelessly abandoned. I watched over the top of my book and felt something move through me that I didn't immediately have a name for. She was different with him. I'd been close enough over those 2 weeks to observe her across various distances. The farmer's market, the road once through the library window, my Nadia in her natural habitat, moving through the world with that contained, watchful quality I'd come to think of as essentially hers. The posture of a woman who scanned before she settled, who assessed before she trusted, who kept something in reserve always, a private room she didn't let people into. With Rafferty, the door to that room was reopened. She was relaxed in the specific way of someone who felt, for the first time in a while, that she was allowed to be. And I sat at my window table and watched this man, this local contractor, this variable I had assessed and filed and dismissed, receive something from her that I had spent 16 months in close study of her and never once seen her give. She had no right. That was the thought I had, sitting there with my coffee cooling in my hand. She had no right to be here, falling for someone, setting down her guard and opening that private room, while the thing she had set in motion 3 years ago was still in motion, while I was sitting 12 miles up a fire road in a rented cabin because of her, because of what she'd chosen to do with a dead woman's case in 43 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon. She had done this, and now she was laughing with her head tilted back like none of it had consequences. Like I had no consequences. This was a problem. In a specific, calculable way, a woman who was guarded noticed more. A woman who was starting to relax and trust, who was letting someone in, who was allowing herself to feel safe, she noticed less. On one hand, that was useful. A distracted Nadia was a less dangerous Nadia, and I was a man who needed her to be less dangerous. On the other hand, a woman who was falling in love started to reassemble herself, started to feel safe enough to think clearly again, to return to the things that mattered to her, to remember who she was before Vermont and sabbaticals and contractors next door. She would go back to herself eventually. My Nadia always went back to herself. I knew this about her, had heard it in 10 years of her work, the particular tenacity of a woman who didn't leave things unfinished. She would go back to the archive. I watched Rafferty order for both of them, watched him do it easily, naturally, like a man who already knew what she wanted, and felt something tighten in my chest that I converted immediately into analysis. I watched my Nadia watch Rafferty, the way she watched things, cataloging and interested, something warm moving underneath the professional attention, like a current under still water, something I recognized, something I had seen directed at interview subjects and witnesses and pieces of evidence that mattered to her. She was interested in him, genuinely, specifically, in the way she was interested in things she intended to understand completely. I looked away, outside, Main Street, the November trees bare and honest. She hadn't gone back to the archive. I'd been tracking this, with everything available to me. Her movements, what she carried, the light in her windows, the equipment box visible through the glass that hadn't moved in 2 weeks. She was writing a book, apparently genuinely, and whatever the book was, it wasn't the Ashworth case. She was moving on. This should have been good news. The recording sitting in her archive, filed under peripheral, gathering dust. Her distracted by a contractor with good instincts and a house next door. The investigation stalled. Nothing moving. I should have been relieved enough to go home. But 2 nights before, I had parked the car and walked the fire road into town after dark. Just to look, just to make sure. I'd stood at the far end of Maple Brook Road in the tree line and looked at the cottage and the light in her window, and I'd stood there for 20 minutes in the cold Vermont dark. I told myself it was surveillance. I stood there for 20 minutes and watched the light in her window and felt the specific physical reality of how close she was, how close I was, how thin the distance was between standing in the trees and walking across that yard and knocking on that door and being, for the first time, simply present with her rather than peripheral to her. I'd stood in the dark for 20 minutes, and what I felt was not reassurance and was not threat assessment. It was something I drove 12 miles back to the cabin with and did not examine. I couldn't leave until I knew for certain it didn't matter, that even if she went back and listened, there was nothing there she could use. The problem was I couldn't know that without hearing the recording myself. Without sitting with those 43 minutes the way she would sit with them, listening for what didn't fit. I needed to get into that cottage, not with her there. I wanted to be precise about my intentions, honest with myself in the way I'd been trying to be since the dark outside her window. I didn't want to harm my Nadia. I'd never wanted to harm her. What I had wanted since a Tuesday afternoon in Indianapolis when she'd looked at me across a coffee shop table with those brown eyes, was something I wasn't going to name, because naming it required an honesty I wasn't prepared for. I wanted the recording. If I could hear it, and confirm there was nothing in it that mattered, I'd go home. Find a way to corrupt the archive copy. Solve it cleanly. Go back to Indianapolis and my ordinary life and my Google alerts and the careful long-distance management of the problem. That was Nadia Vasquez. That was all I wanted. I wasn't a violent man. What happened with Marcus and Claire was a specific circumstance, an argument that escalated, things that couldn't be taken back. But that was Marcus. Marcus was the one who lost control. Marcus was the one whose hands had done the irreversible thing, and I had simply been there, present at the moment the situation slipped beyond managing, unable to stop it, and too implicated to walk away. I was not Marcus. I looked back at the table. Rafferty was saying something quiet, his voice too low to carry across the room, and my Nadia was smiling, the private smile, the one I'd catalogued and filed and returned to more than I would admit, the smile she didn't perform, the smile that happened because something had gotten through. She reached across the table and touched his hand, briefly, lightly, and didn't seem to notice she'd done it. I put a 10 on the table, picked up my camera bag, and walked out before I finished the thought that was forming. Behind me, Nadia and Jake stayed at the table another half hour. I didn't know this. I was already in my car, already thinking through logistics, already building the plan that the clean version of me, the methodical, careful, no-one-gets-hurt version, was going to execute perfectly. Already telling myself that was still the version of this I was living in. I had time. I just needed to be patient.
Jake. The dark-haired man was at Birchen Grounds when Nadia and I went for coffee that Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she'd arrived. I saw him when we walked in. Table by the window, book open, coffee half gone. He'd been there a while. He looked up briefly when the door opened, just the automatic glance anyone gives a new arrival, and then back to his book. I registered him the way I registered everyone in a space. Tourist, regular tourist, or at least he wanted to appear like just another tourist. We ordered. I talked to Nadia about something. I can't remember what. She was laughing about it, that real laugh, and I was mostly thinking about that. The man left, dropped a 10 on the table, picked up his bag, walked out, not hurried, not casual in a performed way, just normal. I looked at the table he'd left, then I looked at the window. From that table, through that window, the sight line ran directly to where Nadia and I were sitting. I said nothing to Nadia. Not then. I was running probability. Was this the same man from the Harvest Festival? Dark hair, beard, camera bag? Could be the same man, could be a different tourist in a tourist town. Vermont in October was full of people with camera bags. What I did was describe him to Gus that afternoon. Gus had lived in Hazel Creek his entire life. He knew every face that belonged here. "Staying at the Birch Hill rental?" he said. "Dark hair, beard?" "Yeah, camera bag. I've seen him," Gus said. "Phil mentioned him too. Said he came into the cidery, didn't buy anything, just kind of looked around." He frowned. "Not like he was deciding whether to buy, more like he was looking at something specific," I said. "Yeah." We looked at each other. "Probably nothing," Gus said. "Town gets tourists." "Yeah," I said. "Probably." But I went home that evening and I told Nadia. All of it. The festival sighting, the coffee shop, the sight lines. I told her without dramatizing it, just the facts, because she was a professional and she deserved the facts and she could assess them better than almost anyone I knew. She listened without interrupting. She was still for the whole of it, not afraid still, thinking still, the journalist assembling information. "Dark hair, beard, camera bag," she said. "Light eyes? Gray, I think. Hard to tell at distance." She was quiet. "What?" I said. "Nothing," she said. Then, "I keep seeing a man. Dark hair, beard. I can't place him, and I keep almost placing him like you've seen him before. Or someone like him, I don't know." She looked at the window. "It's probably hypervigilance. I've been in recovery mode. My nervous system has been on alert for so long that it finds patterns that aren't there." "Maybe," I said. "But you should trust the instinct until you've got reason not to." She looked at me. "You believe in instincts." "I believe in yours," I said. "You've been reading people and situations for a decade. That's not nothing." Something moved through her expression, not quite gratitude, something more complex, the look of a person who has been told their own equipment is untrustworthy for long enough that being told it isn't comes as a surprise. "If you see him again," I said, "tell me." "Jake, please," I said. One word, not asking as a performance of deference, asking because I meant it. She held my gaze for a moment. "Okay," she said. I kissed her forehead and went home, and I sat on my porch with the specific alertness of a man who has switched modes. Not alarm, not yet. But live. The way you go, live in a space that might require you. I texted Gus. "Keep an eye on the dark-haired tourist. Let me know if you see him around Maplebrook Road." Gus texted back. "On it. That was a Tuesday." By Thursday, I wished I'd done more.
Killer. I drove past the cottage on Wednesday evening, slow like a man looking at the scenery. The lights were on. Her lights. My Nadia's lights. Warm in the windows of that small cottage on Maplebrook Road, and I slowed the car and looked at them, the way I'd been looking at them every evening for weeks, with the particular hunger of a man who had reduced himself to drive-bys and tree lines and stolen glimpses through binoculars, because that was all that was available to him, because she had put him here, because she had made this the shape of things with her podcast and her questions and her 43 minutes of tape. Her car was in the drive. Rafferty's truck was not at his house. Rafferty was out. She was alone. I made a second pass, slow. The cottage had a rear window accessible from the backyard. I'd identified this in daylight. walking the road above, noting the property layout with the methodical attention I gave to everything that existed within her orbit. The window latch was old. I was good with old window latches. I was good with most things that required patience and a careful hand and the willingness to take your time. I wasn't going to do anything that night. I want to be precise about that. Precise with myself, in the honest way I'd been trying to practice since the dark outside her window 2 nights before. I just wanted the layout, where she kept her equipment, where the recordings would be stored, whether there was a laptop, an external drive, the specific architecture of the archive that held 43 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon that I needed to hear. I wanted to know the shape of her space, the interior of the place where she slept and worked and touched Rafferty and smiled the private smile. I told myself it was reconnaissance. I parked the car a quarter-mile up the road and walked back through the tree line. What I didn't account for was Gus. A man was walking his dog on the path that ran behind the properties on Maple Brook Road, a large yellow lab that veered toward me the way dogs veered toward anything interesting. Tail moving, nose dropped. The man followed the leash, and when he came around the tree line, he found me standing in the shadows behind the rental cottage, behind her cottage, in the dark, looking up at her window. "Hey." His voice wasn't alarmed. It was direct, the way a hammer was direct. No wasted motion, no performance. "This is private property. You need something?" I looked at him, reassessed. Large man, late 50s, the kind of build that came from decades of physical work, rather than a gym. Confident, in the way of someone who had never particularly needed to perform confidence, because the real thing had always been sufficient. Not afraid. The dog had stopped pulling toward me, I noticed, was sitting at his heel now, watching me with flat, patient eyes that contained no warmth at all. I didn't like that. The dog. "Sorry," I said. "I thought this was the path." "Paths through those trees." He was looking at me with the steady, unhurried look of a man who had built things with his hands for 30 years and had developed, in the process, a finely calibrated sense for when something didn't fit. I was something that didn't fit. I could see him arriving at this conclusion in real time, filing me away with the careful efficiency of someone who trusted his own assessment. "Where are you heading?" "Birch Hill Cabin," I said. "That's way up the fire road. Long walk." "I like walking." He looked at me for a moment that was slightly too long to be comfortable. The dog hadn't moved. It was watching me with that flat animal attention that didn't negotiate or give the benefit of the doubt. And I thought about my Nadia, about the 10 years she'd spent developing the human equivalent of exactly that quality, the ability to look at something and see it without the interference of what she wanted it to be. That dog was looking at me the way she looked at things. I didn't like it at all. "I'll get you back to the path," the man said. It wasn't an offer. It was the quiet, immovable statement of a man who had already decided what was happening and was simply informing me of it. A man who was going to walk me away from the back of his neighbor's cottage and wasn't going to make a discussion out of it and wasn't going to pretend it was anything other than what it was. We walked together through the dark. He stayed slightly behind and to my right. I noticed this immediately, the specific positioning of a man whose instincts were good enough to be inconvenient. I was calculating the whole way, running it through the way I ran everything through, assessing and filing and projecting forward. He'd seen my face. He was connected to this community in the deep structural way of someone who had been here long enough to become part of the place itself, connected to this property, connected almost certainly to the woman inside it and the man next door. He hadn't called or texted anybody yet, but that wasn't the only thing I needed to worry about. I needed to worry about the quiet conversation, the mention over a fence. "Saw a tourist out back of Nadia's place last night. Something felt off." That was enough. That was more than enough. Because Rafferty would tell her, and my Nadia who had spent 10 years reconstructing crimes from the fragments that everyone else had walked past, would feel it. The shift in the air. The thing that didn't fit. And she would go back to the archive not because she'd found something, but because something had found her. And she would sit with that recorded interview, and she would listen, really listen, the way she'd been listening since the moment I'd walked into that Indianapolis coffee shop and sat down across from her and tried to be unremarkable. I had never been unremarkable to her. I understood this now, walking through the Vermont dark with a man whose instincts I respected and resented in equal measure. She had filed me. Whatever she'd heard in those 43 minutes, she'd filed it somewhere in that extraordinary mind, and it was waiting there, patient as everything she did, waiting for the right context to make it matter. At the path entrance, he stopped. "You're staying for the season?" "Few more weeks," I said. "Nice time of year," he said, not making conversation, storing information. I could see him doing it. The same quality of attention the dog had, the same flat, patient, dishonest thing detecting awareness that I was beginning to find in this specific context genuinely alarming. "It is," I said, and walked away. I didn't go to the cabin. I drove 12 miles up the interstate and into a truck stop parking lot and sat in the car in the diesel-smelling dark and thought with the cold, precise focus of a man who understood that the clean version of this was becoming difficult to maintain. The man was a problem. I told myself I was overreacting. He'd found me in a questionable location and walked me to a path. A strange tourist, mildly noted, forgotten within the week. People would be briefly alert. Nothing would come of it. I told myself this for 40 minutes. I built the argument carefully, the way I built everything, and then I dismantled it just as carefully, because I was not a man who survived by believing comfortable things. He would tell Rafferty, and Rafferty would tell my Nadia. And my Nadia would go back to the archive. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose her to that tape. Couldn't let 43 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon be the thing that took her away from Vermont and sabbaticals, and the private smile she gave to men who didn't deserve it. Took her back to the investigation, and the prosecutor, and the careful, terrible work of finding the thing that didn't fit. I couldn't let her find me that way. Not like that. Not in a recording. Not as a subject. I drove back toward Hazel Creek. I found the path, the one I'd walked with him. This man whose name I didn't know yet, whose name I found out later was Gus. Gus Pelletier, 53 years old, married 31 years. A man who had built things and told the truth and walked his dog in the evenings and looked at something that didn't fit and walked straight toward it without hesitating, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind I had spent 3 years pretending to be, the kind I had never been. I walked the path again, in the dark. I won't dress it in the language of contingency and calculation. I made a choice on that path, the second irrevocable choice of my life, made in the dark, with the trees overhead, and the cold coming up from the ground, and somewhere, half a mile away, the warm lights of my Nadia's cottage windows. She had done this. I held on to that. She had started this, had pointed her attention at Claire Ashworth's death, and pulled and kept pulling, until the thread led here, to this path, to this choice, to a good man who had the misfortune of walking his dog on the wrong evening and finding me where I had no business being. Her fault, all of it. I held on to that, the way you held on to something in moving water. I drove back to the cabin. I washed my hands. I was methodical, practical, unhurried. I told myself what I always told myself, that I had done what needed doing, that circumstances had forced my hand, that I was a man responding to a situation rather than a man who had created one. I was very good at telling myself things. I didn't sleep. For the first time since this began, not at all. I lay in the dark in that cabin, 12 miles up a fire road, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let the silence do what silence always did, which was strip everything back to the thing underneath. The thing I'd been covering with calculation and planning, and the clean, methodical language of a man in control of his own story. I saw Gus Pelletier's face, that patient, steady look, the look of a man who had not been afraid of me, not even at the end, not even when he understood what I was. There was something in that I couldn't account for, something that sat in me wrong, like a splinter too deep to reach. I thought about the dog sitting at his heel, watching me, knowing before either of us what I was. I thought about my Nadia, asleep in her cottage half a mile away, unknowing, warm, safe, she thought. Setting things down, she thought. I thought about Claire Ashworth's brown eyes and the way she had looked at me near the end. I'm not a violent man. I thought it over and over in the dark, pressing on it the way you pressed on a bruise compulsively, uselessly, needing to feel the shape of it. I thought it until the words came apart entirely, until there was nothing left of them, until the silence of the Vermont night had taken them completely and given nothing back. Outside, the dark was absolute. I lay in it thinking about my Nadia. I did not sleep.
Jake, I have told you that I don't have a lot of noise in my head. That's still true. But what I have, what the Army gave me that I've never been able to return even now, even 5 years out, is a specific wakefulness at the boundary between sleeping and not. A hair trigger in the unconscious. In the field, it kept me alive. At home, it mostly just means I'm awake at 5 a.m., regardless of what I have to do. Thursday morning, I came awake at 5:23, and the first thing I knew was that I hadn't heard from Gus. He texted me Tuesday. Saw your tourist, back of Dorothy's cottage, east side, around 8. Ran him off. Will tell you more tomorrow. I'd called. No answer. Texted. No reply. I told myself he was asleep. Gus went to bed at 9:30. It was 9:45. And I'd try again in the morning. Morning came, and the texts were still unanswered. I was in my truck by 5:40. Gus's house on Orchard Street was quiet and still, and looked the way houses look when nobody's been in them since the night before. A specific kind of settled stillness, the absence of morning sounds. His truck was in the driveway. I knocked. Nothing. Tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, coffee maker set to auto brew and already done, a full pot sitting cooling. His boots by the door. His coat gone. I walked the property. I found him behind the woodshed, on the path that ran through the trees between the rear lots on this side of Maple Brook Road. I am not going to tell you the details of what I found because they are not mine to give, and because Gus deserves better than to be described in those terms. What I will tell you is that I had seen death before, in places and forms that you hope never to see, and I knew immediately and completely what I was looking at. I stood very still for a long moment. There is a thing that happens in me when the worst possible thing becomes real. A kind of settling, like silt. All the noise and movement drops out, and what's left is very clear and very cold and completely functional. I'd felt it in Afghanistan. I felt it behind Gus's woodshed on a Thursday morning in November. I called 911. I told them what I'd found and where. I told them there was a possible suspect. Gave the description of the dark-haired man, everything I had, height, build, the camera bag, the Birch Hill cabin. I gave them Gus's name and Rosie's number in case no one had reached her. Then I called Dorothy. She answered on the first ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she already knew something. Dorothy. God. Jake, she said. Dorothy. My voice was steady. I made it steady. Gus. A silence. Very brief. I know, she said. Quiet. Just those 2 words, and in them 30 years of knowing a man and his laugh and his work and his hands. I need you to go to Nadia's cottage and stay with her until I get there, I said. Don't let her leave. Don't tell her yet. I want to tell her. Just be there. I'm already putting on my coat, Dorothy said. I waited for the state police. I gave my statement to a detective named Reyes who had good eyes and wasted nothing. I told her everything. The dark-haired man, the Harvest Festival sightlines, the coffee shop window, Gus's Tuesday text. I told her about Nadia's podcast and the Ashworth case and the possibility that someone connected to that investigation had followed her here. Reyes listened without interrupting, made notes, asked 3 questions, all of them precise. Then she said, "We'll need to speak with Ms. Vasquez. How is she?" "She doesn't know yet," I said. "Go tell her," Reyes said. "Then bring her to me." I drove to the cottage. Dorothy opened the door. She looked at me, just looked, and then stepped aside. Nadia was at the kitchen table with coffee she wasn't drinking, and when she saw my face, she stood up. She knew, not the specifics, but she knew from my face that something had happened that was going to change things. I could see her preparing herself for it, squaring her shoulders in that way she had, the woman who had spent a decade making herself receive the worst possible news and not fall apart doing it. "Gus," I said. She closed her eyes, just for a second. When she opened them, they were dry and steady and focused. "Tell me everything." I told her. All of it. She listened the way she listened to everything I said, completely, recording it, building the structure of it. When I finished, she sat back down and she put her hands flat on the table and she breathed, slow and deliberate. "He saw something," she said. "Or someone." "Yes." "Behind my cottage." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. I watched something move through her while Not fear exactly, something more complex, something with guilt in it. The guilt of someone who has brought a dangerous thing into a safe place and watched it touch someone who didn't deserve it. "This is because of me," she said. "No," I said. "Jake, it is not your fault," I said, steady. "Someone made choices. The fault is theirs." She held my eyes. I could see she didn't fully believe me. Not yet. She would eventually. I was going to make sure of that, but not yet. "I need to go to the archive now," she said. "You need to talk to Detective Reyes first now," I said. "Then the archive. Both," she said. "And I need Dorothy to stay." "Dorothy." I looked at Dorothy, who was at the counter making tea with the focused efficiency of someone who needed something to do with her hands. "I'm not going anywhere," Dorothy said, without turning around. That was Thursday morning. That was the day the whole town of Hazel Creek understood that something had crossed over from shadow into real. And the way small towns do when the worst happens, the way they do better than anywhere else I've ever seen, they gathered.
Nadia, I need to tell you about the way Hazel Creek responded to losing Gus, because it was one of the most remarkable things I've witnessed in a life spent witnessing remarkable things. And I have witnessed a great many, most of them in the worst hours of the worst days of other people's lives. They didn't wait to be organized. They organized themselves. By noon on Thursday, the general store had become an unofficial command center. Phil Sorrento had gotten in his truck at 8 that morning and started driving every road within 15 miles, looking for out-of-state plates, looking for a cabin or rental where a dark-haired man in his early 40s might be staying. He had a notebook. He wrote everything down with the focused precision of a man who has decided that every detail might be the one that matters, and you don't get to know which one in advance, so you record all of them. Ted Marsh worked the phones, calling every business in town, building a picture from fragments, doing the slow, patient work of assembly that I recognized from my own investigations, and which I understood required a specific kind of faith that the pieces would eventually cohere. It was Ted who found the Birch Hill cabin. Ted who found the rental booked under the name Tom Wilder. Ted who found the white Subaru rented in Burlington 2 weeks before any of us knew to look. He gave all of it to Detective Reyes before noon. Helen Chen had driven to the state police substation at 7 in the morning with a 4-page written summary of every unfamiliar person she'd noticed in Hazel Creek since October. Dates, times, physical descriptions, and what she called, with characteristic precision, behavioral flags. Reyes told Jake later it was one of the most useful documents she'd received in a case like this. Helen had included 2 mentions of the dark-haired man, specific dates, the observation that he never used the camera despite carrying the bag, and one detail that she'd noticed and noted with the meticulous attention of a woman who has spent years observing things other people walk past. His eyes were lighter than his coloring suggested, as if the palette of his face didn't quite match the rest of him. Jake brought me to the library on Thursday afternoon because I needed to be somewhere that felt like order, like the patient accumulation of things that made sense. And because Evelyn was someone I could think out loud around without performing composure, I didn't have. I sat across from her at the reading table near the window, the one with the view of the mountain, and she told me what she'd seen. Twice. She'd seen him twice. Once inside looking at local road maps, not trail maps, not tourist maps, road maps. Once outside, in what she described with her librarian's precise attention to language as a watching posture, rather than a looking posture. And then she said the thing that stopped me. He had very light eyes, she said. Gray, almost. I remember thinking it was unusual with the dark hair and complexion. The combination seemed off. I sat very still. Off. The word landed somewhere below my sternum and sat there, heavy and specific. Contacts. The thought arrived fully formed, the way the important ones always do. Not built piece by piece, but suddenly just there, the whole shape of it at once. If you changed enough elements, hair dye, a beard grown out, colored contacts, you wouldn't just change individual features. You'd scramble the face holistically. The brain doesn't recognize people feature by feature. It processes the whole configuration at once, the relationships between things, the overall palette. Change enough of the palette and recognition doesn't fire. You become, to people who don't know to look, simply a man with a camera in Vermont. Brown eyes. I had it somewhere in my research notes, the specific mundane detail of it, recorded on a Tuesday afternoon in a coffee shop 3 years ago, in the margin of a page I'd filed under P for peripheral and moved past. Brown eyes don't go gray. I went back to the cottage at 4 o'clock. The archive had been sitting on my laptop since Brooklyn, untouched, deliberately, the way you don't touch a wound you're not ready to look at. I opened it for the first time since I'd arrived in Vermont, and the familiar structure of it, the folders, the timelines, the 31 interview recordings organized by date, hit me with a physical weight I hadn't anticipated. Like opening a door and finding a room you thought you'd left behind, exactly as you left it. I went to the peripheral interviews, the ones I'd gathered in the early months, before I'd found the thread, when I was still casting wide and pulling everything. Daniel Voss. Cooperative. Pleasant. Out of town that weekend? Alibi verified. Filed and set aside. I opened my notes from the interview and I read them, and then I read them again, and then I sat back and I pressed my hands flat against the desk because they had started to shake. The notes were thorough. I am always thorough. It is the one thing I do without fail, the one professional standard I have never let slip. And they told me nothing I hadn't already known intellectually. But there, in the margin, in my own handwriting, in the blue ink I always used for observations that weren't evidence but weren't nothing either. Seems ready. 2 words, written by my own hand 3 years ago. By the part of me that had noticed something and named it and then set it down. Looked at my notebook. Moved on. I stared at those 2 words for a long time. I want to tell you what happened inside me in that moment, because I think it's important to be honest about it. There was the professional part, the part that was already building the logical structure, connecting Evelyn's gray eyes to the coffee shop's brown ones. Connecting seems ready to a man who had known exactly what questions to expect, because he had lived inside the answers for 18 months. That part was running, assembling, doing what it does. And underneath it, underneath the professional machinery that I had spent 10 years building and maintaining, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with logic. I knew. Not everything. Not enough. But something. Something had moved in me in that coffee shop, in that specific moment I had documented with 2 words and then abandoned. And I had let it go because the alibi was clean and the cooperation was convincing and I was thorough, but I was not infallible. And I had made a choice without knowing I was making one. And Gus Pelletier had walked his dog on the wrong path at the wrong time. The anger came up so fast it frightened me. Not the managed professional anger I'd learned to work with, the kind you acknowledge and set aside and use as fuel without letting it run the engine. This was older and larger than that, coming from somewhere below the professional self entirely. I was angry at myself with a ferocity I hadn't felt since the bathroom floor in Brooklyn. At the 2 words I'd written and abandoned, at the instinct I'd named and ignored, at the version of me who had sat in a coffee shop across from a man and felt something shift and chosen, in the way you choose things without choosing them, not to look at what was shifting. And then the anger turned, and what it turned into was something colder and more absolute. Daniel Voss. Daniel Voss, who had stood in a parking lot between a school and an apartment building and made a choice. Daniel Voss, who had sat across from me in a coffee shop with his practiced sorrow and his prepared answers and his brown eyes, and said real shame what happened about a woman whose life he had taken. Daniel Voss, who had driven to Burlington 2 weeks ago, rented a white Subaru under a false name, and followed me, to a town of 3,000 people who had done nothing, who had only ever been kind, who had given me Joni Mitchell through a coffee shop door and aged cheddar and a library card processed in under 3 minutes. Who had given me Gus. The anger was so large I couldn't hold it in my chest. It pressed against the inside of my ribs, looking for somewhere to go, and I sat at my desk in the small cottage in Vermont, and I breathed through it the way Dr. Wee had taught me, and I let it be there without letting it run me, because I needed to think clearly, and I needed to think now. Because if it was Voss, and I believed, with the bone-deep certainty of an instinct I was not ignoring this time, that it was Voss, then he had come here because something in that interview had scared him. Something he had said, or almost said, or nearly not said in time. Some thread he had seen me pick up and hadn't been certain I would put back down. Whatever it was on the recording. 43 minutes of interview audio sitting in a folder on my laptop that I had listened to exactly once and then filed. I went and found Jake. He was on his porch when I came across the 40 feet, and he took one look at my face and stood up from his chair with the particular quality of stillness that I had come to understand was not stillness at all. It was the opposite. It was everything in him coming to attention at once. "Tell me," he said. "I think it's Voss," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was a professional habit I couldn't always control. "The landlord from the original investigation. I think he changed his appearance. I think he's been here for weeks watching me. I think Gus found him behind my cottage." Something moved across Jake's face. Something I felt in my own chest because I knew his face now, had learned it in these weeks, and what moved across it was not just alarm. It was the specific, controlled fear of a person who cares about someone and is calculating threat in real time. "Reyes," he said. "We call Reyes right now." "Tonight," I said. "I'm going to. But first I need to go through the recording. Jake." I stopped, tried to find the words for what I needed him to understand. Whatever he's afraid I heard, it's on that tape. 43 minutes of interview audio, and somewhere in it is the thing that brought him here. I need to know what it is before I talk to Reyes. I need to know what I'm giving her. "Nadia." He said my name the way he sometimes did. Not a question, not a command, just the full weight of his attention concentrated into 2 syllables. "You are not going to be alone right now. That's not something I'm willing to negotiate." "It's interview audio," I said. "I'll be at my desk. I don't care if it's a podcast episode and a cup of tea." His voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't, and I recognized it because I'd heard it before. The operational mode, the soldier, the part of him that assessed situations in terms of what could go wrong and what could be done about it. Someone has been watching you, someone who is not afraid to hurt people. You're not going to be alone in that cottage with your headphones in. I looked at him, and I understood. I understood completely. The worry in him, the specific fear, because it was the same fear I'd have felt if our positions were reversed, and I would not have been able to talk him into leaving either. But I needed him to understand something too. Jake. I waited until I was sure he was hearing me, and not just the operational calculation. "I need to do this alone. Not because I don't—" I stopped, steadied. "Not because you being there wouldn't help, but because if what's on that tape is what I think it is, if I put this together tonight and it breaks me open the way the first episode did, I need to do that without anyone watching. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He was very still. "I just got myself back together," I said, and my voice cracked slightly on it, which I hadn't intended, which told me exactly how true it was. "Piece by piece, over the last several weeks, I have put myself back together, and if I fall apart tonight, if this is the thing that does it, the thing that breaks me again, I need to fall apart alone. I can't be watched while that happens. I can't." Something shifted in his face. The operational calculation didn't leave. I didn't expect it to leave, but something behind it changed. The understanding arriving, painful, because understanding didn't mean comfort. "I'll call you," I said, "the moment I'm done. Whatever I find, whatever state I'm in, I'll call you." "Nadia." "Jake." I reached out and put my hand on his arm briefly, the way you touch someone when you need them to feel that the thing you're saying is true. 1 hour. Give me 1 hour. If you haven't heard from me, I'm coming over," he said. Not a threat, a fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who meant every word. 1 hour, not a minute more. And Nadia? He caught my hand before I could pull it back, held it just for a moment. His eyes on mine, and in them the specific unguarded thing that I had stopped trying to look away from in recent days. You are not the same person who broke the first time. You came here and you rebuilt yourself, and whatever you find on that tape, whatever it costs you tonight, you are not going to fall apart the same way. I believe that even if you can't right now. I didn't trust my voice to answer. I squeezed his hand once and walked back across the 40 feet. I sat at my desk. I put my headphones in. I opened the file labeled Voss Daniel, Peripheral Interview, March. I pressed play and I listened to myself ask a question I had asked 31 times before to 31 different people, and I listened to his answer, and I began. I didn't know, when I pressed play, that he had already decided tonight was the night. I didn't know that an hour was going to be too long.
Killer. I knew the police were looking for me. I'd driven past the general store at midday and seen the vehicles, seen the man with the notebook going door to door, seen the energy of a town that had closed ranks around its own. Small towns did that, moved slowly until something broke the surface, and then all at once, with the particular momentum of people who knew each other's names and had decided, collectively, that they were owed an answer for Gus Pelletier. I drove away carefully. I always did everything carefully. It wasn't enough anymore. I was beginning to understand that. The cabin was compromised. Tom Wilder's name was probably already on a list. Cash rental, small town, murder investigation, the kind of detail that a thorough man with a notebook reached by end of day without even trying. I needed to move that night. I couldn't come back, but I couldn't leave without her, my Nadia. I sat with that thought in the cabin for a long time, turned it over, examined it from every angle the way I examined everything, looking for the place where it stopped being true, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it because it wasn't a thought born from strategy or contingency or the careful risk assessment of a methodical man. It was something older and simpler and more honest than any of that. I couldn't leave without knowing what was on that recording. That was what I told myself. That was the clean version, the version where I was still a man with a plan, a man managing outcomes, a man who had driven 600 miles north for a specific rational purpose that had nothing to do with the way her hair looked when she pushed it back from her face without breaking stride. I told myself that. I was running low on things to tell myself. The coldness had been getting easier to access since Wednesday night on the path through the trees. I'd noticed this about myself and filed it without feeling it, the way I'd been filing things without feeling them for 3 years, since the night with Claire Ashworth, that I'd been managing the consequences of ever since. The coldness was useful. The coldness was the only thing standing between me and the full, unmedicated reality of what I had become in a Vermont autumn. Because a woman I couldn't stop thinking about had made a podcast about a dead woman I hadn't meant to kill. Her fault. I held on to that. I had been holding on to it for weeks, like a rope over open water, and I held on to it now, in the cabin, in the last light of the last afternoon I would spend in this place. She had done this. My Nadia, brilliant, relentless, impossible mind, had pointed her attention at Claire Ashworth's death, and pulled and kept pulling, and the thread had led here, to Gus Pelletier, on a dark path, to a notebook going door to door, to me sitting in a rented cabin under another man's name with nowhere left to go except toward her. She had built this, every step of it, and I'd followed the architecture of her choices here, to this night, to this last irrevocable movement in a story she had started and I was going to finish. I'd watched the cottage since late afternoon, binoculars, parked down the road, the particular patience of a man who understood that patience was the last tool he had left. I'd watched the laptop come out of its case, watched my Nadia settle at the desk in the second bedroom, her profile in the window light, the specific quality of her stillness when she was working, that absolute total concentration that I had spent 16 months studying from a distance and weeks studying from the tree line, in which I knew, by now, the way you knew music that had lived in you long enough to become part of your own rhythm. She was in the archive for 20 minutes. Then she got up and went to Rafferty's house. I watched her cross the yard in the dark and knock on his door and go inside, and I sat in the car with my hands on the wheel and breathed through what that cost me. She was going to him, running to him, probably. Something in the archive had moved her enough to need the specific comfort of that man, that contractor, that variable I had assessed as civilian and dismissed and been wrong about in ways I was only beginning to fully calculate. She'd found something. I knew it the way I knew her, completely, from the outside, from a distance she didn't know existed. She'd found me. Then she came back. I watched Rafferty's house after she went back inside. The big man stood on his porch for a long time, looking toward the cottage, looking toward the road, his arms crossed, his stillness, the stillness of someone running through scenarios, someone whose instincts were telling him something his conscious mind was still catching up to. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know what yet. He went inside. I waited until 11. I parked the car half a mile up the road, past the tree line, and I walked back through the dark. The town was asleep. Small towns went to bed early and trusted the dark to be empty, because in small towns the dark usually was. No lights on Maplebrook Road except the cottage. Second bedroom window, faint glow. She was still at the archive. She was still there, my Nadia, sitting in that pale laptop light in the second bedroom of a rented cottage in Vermont, and she was listening. I knew she was listening. I could feel it from across the yard the way you felt weather coming. The specific atmospheric pressure of her attention directed at something that mattered, directed at me. I stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, just a moment. I looked at the light in her window and I felt the full, complicated, unmanageable truth of why I was there. Not the clean version, not the recording and the archive and the contingency plan, but the real thing underneath all of it. The thing I had been driving toward since a Tuesday afternoon in Indianapolis when she'd looked at me across a coffee shop table, and I'd walked out with my hands sweating and never quite recovered. She was extraordinary. She had always been extraordinary, and she had wasted it. Wasted all of it, on dead women and cold cases and the particular obsessive pursuit of truths that other people had tried to bury, truths that should have stayed buried, truths that had done nothing except drag us both here to this yard, this night, this last possible version of the story. She could have left it alone. She could have left Claire alone, left me alone, left the case in the closed file where it belonged. She could have been anything, and she was extraordinary enough to have been anything. But she had chosen this, had chosen the archive and the recordings and the 43 minutes of a man who had sat across from her, trying to be unremarkable and failed, apparently, in ways he still didn't fully understand. She had chosen everyone except me. I crossed the yard. The kitchen window gave the way I knew it would. The old latch, the improperly seated secondary catch, the specific vulnerability I had identified and cataloged and waited on. I eased it up slowly. No sound. I went through. Inside the cottage was warm and it smelled like her. I hadn't been prepared for that. I had prepared for everything else. The layout, the archive, the laptop, the external drive, the 43 minutes I had come here to hear and assess and deal with. I had not prepared for the specific physical reality of her space, the smell of her coffee and her wood smoke and whatever she used on her hair, the particular warmth of a place that a person had made their own over weeks of living in it. Her books on the table, her jacket over the chair, her coffee cup on the counter with the ring it had left on the wood. Her life, small and ordinary and completely, unbearably real. I stood in the dark kitchen and felt something I hadn't felt since the night with Claire Ashworth. Something I had no clean language for. Not the cold, the opposite of the cold. Something that moved through me like a current and left me standing very still in the dark with my hands at my sides and the full weight of 16 months pressing down on the moment. She was 20 feet away. From the second bedroom, through the closed door, I could hear it. Faint. She was wearing headphones. But I knew that sound. I had it on my phone. I had listened to this podcast in the dark of my Indianapolis apartment more times than I would ever admit to anyone, studying her the way you studied something that was coming for you, learning the rhythms of her voice, the texture of her attention, the specific quality of her silences. And underneath her breathing, underneath the ambient sound of the recording playing through her headphones, I could hear the faint ghost of another voice. My voice. Tuesday afternoon, 3 years ago. A coffee shop I had sat in, with my hands sweating inside my jacket pockets, telling myself I was holding it together. She'd found it. Of course she had. Of course. She was Nadia Vasquez, and she had been built, it sometimes seemed to me, specifically and precisely for the purpose of finding the things I needed her not to find. for pointing her extraordinary, relentless, impossible attention at the exact places I needed her to look away from. She had been doing it for 3 years from a distance, and now she was doing it 20 feet away through a closed door on the last night I'd left, and I stood in her kitchen in the dark and felt something shift in me that I didn't try to name. It was over, the clean version, the no-one-gets-hurt version, the version where I heard the recording, and it was nothing. And I went home to Indianapolis and my coffee maker, and my bookshelves, and the photograph of my mother on the wall. That version had ended on a path in the Vermont dark with a good man who had walked his dog on the wrong evening. What remained was this, her, me. 20 feet in a closed door, and 16 months of Google alerts and 10 years of podcast episodes, listened to in the dark, and 43 minutes of tape that she had found because she always found everything. And I had been a fool to think, had been telling myself things for 3 years, comfortable things, necessary things, things that were dissolving now in the warm dark of her kitchen like paper in water. I moved through the cottage, past her books and her jacket and her coffee cup with its ring on the wood, past the small ordinary evidence of her life, the life she had been living in this place without any idea that I had been living 12 miles away, in the dark, watching her lights, memorizing her walk, holding on to the blame because the blame was the only thing that made the rest of it bearable. I put my hand on the doorknob of the second bedroom. I thought about the first time I'd heard her voice, not in person, on a podcast, 2 years before the interview, a case I'd listened to in the car on a long drive, and found myself sitting in the parking lot at the end, unable to move, because I'd never heard anyone think out loud the way she thought out loud, with that particular combination of precision and humanity that made you feel like truth was something warm rather than something cold. I had sought out the interview. I had agreed to sit across from her in that coffee shop. I had told myself it was management, containment, the careful strategy of a man who needed to know what she knew. And I had sat across from her for 43 minutes and walked out into the Indianapolis afternoon and stood on the sidewalk in the October light and understood, with the specific clarity of something you've known for a while, finally arriving in the part of you that admits things, that I had wanted to sit across from her, that I had wanted her to look at me, that some part of me had wanted to be found. I turned the doorknob. I opened the door. She had her back to me, headphones on, shoulders slightly forward, the posture I knew. The total consuming concentration of Nadia Vasquez at work, the posture that meant she had found the thing, was sitting with the thing, was turning it over in that extraordinary mind with the patience of a woman who had learned that the truth revealed itself completely only to people willing to wait for it. The laptop screen cast her in pale blue light. The waveform of the audio file moved across it. My voice, faint through the headphones, filling the room she didn't know I was standing in. She stopped the recording. The silence was absolute. I watched her go still, not the stillness of someone who had heard a sound behind them, something deeper than that, the stillness of completion, of a mind that had been working towards something for 3 years and had just arrived. The stillness of Nadia Vasquez at the moment, the thing that didn't fit, finally irrevocably fit. She knew. She reached for her phone. "Don't," I said. She pulled the headphones off slowly, carefully, with the deliberate, measured movements of a woman managing herself under pressure, a woman who was afraid and was not going to let the fear make her stupid. She turned around, and she looked at me, really looked at me, through the hair and the beard and the contacts, through all of it, straight through to the face she had sat across from in a coffee shop 3 years ago, the face she had filed away in that archive of a mind and kept, apparently in the same careful way she kept everything. "Daniel," she said, not a question, not surprise. A confirmation delivered in a steady voice that cost her something. I could see what it cost her. Could see the exact price of that steadiness, in the set of her jaw and the way she was breathing. And she paid it anyway, without flinching. Because she was my Nadia, and she did not flinch. "Hello, Nadia," I said, and here's what I hadn't planned for. Here's the thing that all the preparation and the contingency and the cold, methodical management of outcomes had not accounted for. She was looking at me, and I was looking at her, and we were in the same room for the first time since a Tuesday afternoon in Indianapolis. And she was the most extraordinary person I had ever been close to, and I had done terrible things to be standing in this room, and she knew it, and I knew she knew it, and none of it, made me want to look away. She was afraid, and she was thinking, simultaneously, without one impairing the other, with a discipline that was the most dangerous thing about her, And also, God help me, God help both of us, the most beautiful. She was looking at me with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and I felt, standing in the doorway of her bedroom in the wreckage of everything I had built and burned and built again, the full impossible truth of 16 months of Google alerts and 10 years of podcasts listened to in the dark. I had not come to Vermont for a recording. I had come for her. I had always been coming for her, from the moment she'd pointed her attention at something I'd needed her to leave alone, from the moment she'd chosen to pull the thread, from the moment she'd looked at me across a coffee shop table with those eyes and asked her careful questions and made me feel, for 43 minutes, like the most interesting thing in the room. She had done this to me, had made me into this man standing in her doorway, in the ruins of Tom Wilder and the Birch Hill Cabin and the clean version and the no one gets hurt version. This man who had crossed every line available to him and was standing on the other side of all of them, looking at her. Her fault. I tried it one last time, held it up against the light of her eyes, and felt it dissolve completely. Not her fault, mine. I had known it on the path with Gus. I had known it in the kitchen with her jacket over the chair. I had known it for 16 months in the dark of my apartment, with her voice in my ears and her name in my alerts, and the comfortable lies I'd told myself about threat assessment and contingency planning, and being a methodical man who did not do impulsive things. I had done one impulsive thing in my life. I was looking at her. She held my gaze with those steady, terrible, beautiful eyes, and she did not look away, and neither did I. And outside the Vermont dark was absolute and indifferent. And somewhere 40 feet away, a man named Jake Rafferty was standing in his house, not knowing what was happening in the cottage next door. And I thought about Gus Pelletier's patient face and Claire Ashworth's brown eyes and the Google alert on my phone that had started all of this, that she had started, that I had followed here to this room, to this woman, to this moment that had been, I understood now, inevitable from the first word she had ever spoken into a microphone about a dead woman in Indianapolis. She had built this story. We were standing in the last chapter of it. "What happens now, Daniel?" she said, quiet, steady, her voice the same voice I had listened to in the dark for 16 months, and nothing like it. I looked at her, my Nadia. I didn't have an answer. For the first time in 3 years, in the long, careful management of the consequences of one impulsive night, I did not have a plan. I had only this room and this woman and the wreckage of everything I had told myself, spread out around us like the evidence of a life that had been, from the very beginning, aimed at exactly here. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had always been good at waiting. Outside, somewhere on Maplebrook Road, a door opened. Rafferty. I saw it register in her eyes before I heard the sound. The flicker of something. Not quite hope, not quite relief. Something more complicated than either. The specific expression of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and was doing the math and was not going to let me see her do it. She was extraordinary. She had always been extraordinary, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with a man who had crossed 600 miles and every line available to him, just to stand in the same room with her. And finally, after 16 months of distance and darkness and comfortable lies, be seen. I had wanted her to look at me. She was looking at me. This was not what I had planned. This was the only thing that had ever been true.
Nadia, I want to tell you about the 31-minute mark first, because that's where it was. That's the thing I missed. That's the thread I walked past 3 years ago and left hanging, and Gus Pelletier paid for it with his life, and I am going to have to live with that in whatever way I figure out how to live with things. But first, what was on the tape? I had been in the archive for 40 minutes, listening the way I'd been trained to listen across a decade of doing this work. Not for what I expected to hear, but for what was actually there. Clearing my mind of everything I thought I already knew and letting the audio be new. It's harder than it sounds. It requires a specific kind of emptiness that doesn't come naturally when you're sitting alone in a cottage at 11 o'clock at night, knowing that somewhere within 15 miles of you is a man who has already killed twice. For 30 minutes, it was exactly what my notes said it was. Cooperative. Prepared. Pleasant in the practiced, slightly hollow way I'd documented and not followed. His voice was good. Calm. Measured. the voice of a man who had rehearsed without letting the rehearsal show. And then I got back Sunday evening. My own recording of his voice, compressed and slightly flat the way 3-year-old audio gets, but clear, every word clear. Around 7:30, I saw Claire's light on when I came in. She was usually in bed by 8 on Sundays. She had early mornings. I stopped the recording. I took my headphones off slowly and set them on the desk. I sat very still, and I let the 31-minute mark simply exist in the room with me while my brain did what my brain does. Assembled, connected, laid the pieces against each other, and showed me the shape they made. The prosecution's timeline. Established brick by careful brick over the course of a trial I had sat through in the gallery and annotated in every margin I could find. Marcus Webb had testified he arrived at 8 p.m., that Claire had let him in, that the argument had begun at 8:15. But Voss was home at 7:30. Voss, whose alibi was the Cincinnati conference, verified, no gaps, was home at 7:30. A full hour before the prosecution's timeline, and he had seen Claire's light on. Building access, his own key, his name on the lease, on the building account, on every lock in that place. If he was home at 7:30, he was in that building before Marcus Webb ever arrived, and if he was home and Claire's light was on and he had something to say to her, something he'd needed to say for however long the pressure of it had been building, then whatever happened in Claire Ashworth's apartment did not begin at 8 o'clock with a cousin who lost control. It began earlier, with a landlord, with a key, with a conversation that went somewhere it was never supposed to go, or somewhere it was always going to go depending on which version of Daniel Voss you believed. Marcus Webb, loyal, family first, backup plan Marcus, had covered for him, had taken the primary charge, had given the prosecutor a first name and nothing more because a first name was the exact minimum required to reduce his sentence without destroying someone he considered family. I understood all of this in the span of 2 breaths. The cold that moved through me was not the Vermont cold. It was the specific cold of a thing clicking into place that should have clicked 3 years ago in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon when a man with brown eyes had said real shame what happened and I had written seems ready in the margin and closed my notebook. I reached for my phone. "Don't," someone said. I turned around and Daniel Voss was standing in the doorway of my studio. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment. Not the professional response, not the journalist reflex, but what happened in my body in the first half second before any of it kicked in. It was terror. Clean, animal, absolute. The kind that exists below language and below training and below everything you've built on top of your instincts over the course of your life. My heart didn't speed up. It seemed to stop entirely. One long suspended beat, and then it came back at twice the rate and my hands went cold, and every nerve ending I had said, "Run." In a voice that had no interest in strategy. That was the first half second. The second half second, the training came up. I looked at him. Really looked. The way I'd looked at 31 people over 8 months of investigation, and had looked at him last and least carefully. The dyed black hair, flat and wrong under the lamplight, in the way box dye always is. The beard still growing into its final shape, slightly uneven at the jaw. The gray contacts sitting over brown irises, visible now at this distance in a way it wouldn't have been from across the street. A thin, gray ring over a darker color, like a sky that hadn't quite finished changing. Dark clothes, dark jacket, and the knife. Held at his side with the practiced ease of a man who had been carrying it long enough to forget it was a choice. I catalogued all of this and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I need to record this. A single tap of a button on my laptop engaged the audio recorder. The red indicator light was now on. Every word spoken in this room was going onto that file. I thought, Jake gave me 1 hour. How much of that hour is left? I thought, I know how to do this. I have spent 10 years learning how to sit across from people who have done terrible things and make them talk. I know what they need. I know what the story costs them and what it would cost them to lose it. He has been living inside a version of this for 3 years. If I can get inside it with him, I can buy time. These thoughts happened in approximately 3 seconds. "Daniel," I said. My voice was steady, warm, even. The interview voice, the one built over a decade of practice, the one that said, "I'm here for the truth, not the judgment. Just tell me." I am proud of that voice. I have never been more grateful for it than I was in that moment. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who had crossed so many lines that the original line was no longer visible from where he stood. "You heard it," he said. "Walk me through it," I said. "What actually happened? Not Marcus's version, yours." He measured me. I could see it, the calculation running behind his eyes, the same calculation I'd missed in the coffee shop because I hadn't wanted to see it. How much did I know? How much could I prove? Whether 43 minutes of 3-year-old audio was enough to do what he feared it could do. "The recording," he said. "Tell me what happened," I said, "and I'll tell you what's on it." A lie. The cleanest lie I've ever told. But it was the right lie, in the right voice, with the right quality of stillness behind it. All of it, Daniel. From the beginning. Something shifted in him. The story. The one he'd been living inside for 3 years, the one he'd refined and carried and told himself in the dark until it had become the only reality he had access to. It needed to be heard. They always do. In 10 years of this work, I have never met a person who had done something terrible and didn't, on some level, need someone to know the real version. The true cost of a secret is that you have to carry it entirely alone, and the weight of that changes people in ways they don't always understand until someone offers to share the load. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said. He took a step into the room. I made myself stay still, made myself hold his gaze with the expression that said, "I'm listening. Go on." Made my hands stay flat on the desk rather than pressing into it the way they wanted to. Claire had found out about some financial issues with the building. The way I was managing certain accounts. It would have ended things for me professionally. She was going to report it. He paused. I went to talk to her, Sunday evening, around 7. And Marcus was already there, I said. He was going to help me talk to her, persuade her. That was the word I used. His jaw tightened. Just persuade her. Make her understand what would happen if she didn't let it go. I held his gaze. But it went further than persuasion. The tightening spread across his whole face, a closing, like a door. Marcus was supposed to scare her. That was all I said. I told him, scare her, make her understand, and we'd all walk away. His voice dropped, and underneath the flatness of it, I heard something that might have been the ghost of what it had cost him, once, before he'd buried it deep enough. I was in the hallway. I heard it. I heard when it stopped being an argument, and by the time I went in, it was done, I said. Yes. The word fell out of him like something heavy. Yes. He had been moving while he talked. Not fast, not obviously, but with the slow, patient intention of someone who had planned this and was executing the plan one careful step at a time. He was 4 feet away now. The desk between us had never felt smaller. The knife was still at his side, but his grip on it had changed. So you helped Marcus cover it, I said, and I kept my voice exactly level, exactly warm, exactly the voice of a woman who is here for the story and not for the knife. You made sure your alibi held. You stayed on paper in Cincinnati. You came home Sunday and you waited and you let the investigation find Marcus, and you said real shame what happened to anyone who asked. I had no choice, he said. And Gus, I said, did you have a choice there? His face closed completely. The story was done. The story had reached its end, and we both knew it, and whatever calculation he'd been running behind his eyes had just finished running. I can't go to prison, he said. Flat, final. The voice of a man who has been over this so many times, it has become simple arithmetic. I know, I said, so you understand why I'm here. I understand why you think you're here, I said. and I shoved the laptop off the desk with both hands as hard as I could. It caught him in the chest, not enough to hurt, enough to surprise. And the half-second of his flinch was all I needed. I was up and moving before the laptop hit the floor, going right, because right was toward the window, and the window was the only other exit, and I had already mapped this room a dozen times in the last hour, in the specific way that a decade of instinct training will make you map a room you're in alone at night. I got 2 steps. His hand caught my upper arm, not the wrist, the full grip of his hand around my upper arm, and he was bigger than me, and stronger. And I had known this going in, which is why when he pulled me back, I didn't fight the pull. I went with it, let his own force do the rotation, and turned inside it, and drove the heel of my hand upward toward his face with everything I had. It wasn't perfect. I'm not trained. My angle was wrong by about 15 degrees, and I caught his cheek instead of his nose, which meant stagger instead of drop. But stagger was enough. It was 1 second of his grip loosening and his weight shifting and the knife not quite where he needed it to be, and I wrenched my arm free and screamed. Not words, sound. The loudest, most sustained sound I have made in my entire life, pulled from somewhere below the diaphragm, from the place where the real things live, because I needed Jake to hear it through solid walls and 40 feet of Vermont night air, and I was not going to produce anything less than everything I had. He recovered faster than I needed him to. His hand found my hair before I could get clear. Not a grab, a grip, fingers closed and pulling, and the pain of it was immediate and white-hot and personal in the way that particular violence always is. Something ancient in the nervous system that responds to it with a specific combination of rage and terror that I had never felt before, and hope never to feel again. He slammed me into the wall. My shoulder hit first, then the back of my head, and my vision went white at the edges and narrowed to a bright, unsteady point. And I was on my way down before I'd made the decision to go down, my knees hitting the hardwood floor with a crack that I'd feel for days. I put my hands out, stayed conscious, stayed thinking. The white cleared in the edges of my vision. He was above me, the knife in his right hand. His breathing hard now, the prepared pleasantness entirely gone from his face. Stripped away, all the way down to what was underneath it, which was something I recognized from crime scene photographs and victim statements and the particular vocabulary of violence done by people who tell themselves they had no choice. His face was the face of a man who had done the arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion and was now only waiting for a reason not to act on it. I thought, with a calm that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the specific clarity that arrives in the moments where the body understands it may not survive. Jake knows. Jake is coming. You have to last until Jake gets here. That is the only job. That is all you have to do. Stop, Voss said. His voice had shed its final layer. No warmth, no management, no practiced sorrow. Just the thing that had been in the coffee shop that Tuesday afternoon that I had written seems ready about and set down. Stop moving. Okay, I said. My voice was almost unrecognizable to me. Scraped raw, slightly unsteady, nothing like the interview voice. I'd lost the interview voice somewhere between the wall and the floor. Okay, Daniel. Okay. He crouched, brought himself to eye level, the knife between us. His gray over brown eyes were very close. The recording, he said. Tell me exactly what's on it. I held his gaze. I thought about the red indicator light on the laptop, still on, still running, recording this. I thought about Claire's light on a Sunday evening at 7:30. I thought about Gus Pelletier, who had walked his dog on the wrong path, who had never done anything except be decent and pay attention and care about the people around him. I thought about Jake. Your voice, I said. 31 minutes in. You say you saw her light on at 7:30. That's an hour before the prosecution's established timeline. It puts you in the building before Marcus Webb arrived. I kept my eyes on his. It makes you the first person there, Daniel. It changes everything about what happened and why. He closed his eyes. 1 second, maybe 2. The knife didn't move. When he opened them, the calculation was complete. He reached for me. The window exploded. Not quite exploded. That's the word my mind produced in the moment, the word that captured what it felt like, the suddenness of it, the sound of old wood giving way and cold air flooding in and glass singing against the sill. It opened fast and hard under one sharp impact, and Jake Rafferty came through it. Not over the sill. Through, one hand on the frame, body following, the fluid-controlled movement of a man for whom this was not the first time he had needed to enter a room through something other than the door, in a situation where what was happening inside it could not wait for the door. He landed and was already moving before Voss registered exactly what was happening, not running, not scrambling, but with the absolute economy of motion of someone whose body knows exactly what it's doing and has stopped consulting the mind about it. Voss heard the window. He came up from the crouch and turned toward the sound, and in the turning he was away from me. His weight shifted, and I pressed my back against the wall and made myself small and stayed out of the space between them. The light caught Jake's face, and I want to tell you what I saw there because I need you to understand that what I saw was not rage in the way I had known rage before, not hot, not uncontrolled, not the version that makes people sloppy and reactive. What was on Jake Rafferty's face was colder and more absolute than that. It was the face of a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been afraid he'd arrive, and had made every decision about what he was going to do here before he came through the window. He looked at Voss. He looked at me. One fraction of a second. Inventory. Are you hurt? How hurt? And I shook my head, which was not entirely accurate, but was the most important thing I could communicate. He looked back at Voss. Voss brought the knife around in a wide arc, the motion of someone who wants distance more than contact, who is still calculating, still looking for the outcome where this ends without adding to the arithmetic. Jake didn't retreat. He stepped into it, inside the arc, inside the radius of the blade, where the geometry of it worked for him instead of for the knife, and caught Voss's knife hand at the wrist with his right hand and at the elbow with his left. And he applied leverage with the clean mechanical certainty of someone who has done this in places where getting it wrong was not an available outcome. There was a sound, a hard, organic sound, the sound of a joint being taken to the edge of what it was designed to do. The knife hit the floor. Voss made a sound, half pain, half something more animal, and tried to pull free, tried to use his size, tried to turn the way I had turned inside his grip. Jake was already ahead of it. He moved with Voss's turn rather than against it, redirecting, and in 3 seconds, Voss was against the studio wall with Jake's forearm horizontal across his throat and Jake's full weight behind it, Voss's feet barely on the floor, and Jake's face 6 inches from Voss's face. Jake said one word. Don't. One word. In a register I had never heard from him, low and absolute and entirely without heat, which was somehow worse than heat would have been, the voice of a man who was not threatening, who was simply stating the physics of the situation. Voss went still. The room went still. I became aware of several things in sequence. That I was still on the floor with my back against the wall, that my hands were shaking badly enough that I could see them shaking, that somewhere in the last 4 minutes I had bitten my lip hard enough to taste copper, that the red indicator light on the laptop was still on, that the wood stove was still ticking in the other room like none of this had happened, that Jake's eyes had found me again over Voss's shoulder and were not leaving me. Nadia. His voice had changed. Same register, but different underneath it. Something tightly controlled that I recognized as the thing he was choosing not to let out right now because right now was not the time, and he knew it. Are you hurt? Not a question. An assessment. He needed data. My head, I said. I hit the wall. I'm okay. A pause. The recording is still running. Something moved in his jaw. The recording, he said. Everything? Everything, I said. From when he came in. A long breath through his nose. Voss made a small sound. Not words, just the sound of a man arriving at the full dimensions of the space he had put himself in. Jake's forearm didn't move. I crawled, literally crawled across the floor, because my legs were not going to hold me yet, to the laptop, and I looked at the red light for a moment. This small, ordinary indicator light on a cracked laptop screen that had been running quietly through all of it, recording Daniel Voss's voice saying it wasn't supposed to go that far, and I pressed stop. Then I called Reyes. She picked up on the first ring. I told her what I had and where I was, and she said she was 12 minutes away in the voice of someone who was already in motion, already covering ground. And I believed her. I set the phone face up on the floor beside me. I looked at Jake. He was still holding Voss against the wall with an absolute, unmoving steadiness, and he was looking back at me, and I could see the thing he was holding in check behind his eyes. Not the soldier, not the operational calculation, but the other thing. The thing underneath all of that. The thing that had come through a window in a Vermont night because an hour had been too long and he had known it. I thought about what he'd said on the porch before I walked back across the 40 feet. You are not the same person who broke the first time. I thought about Claire Ashworth's classroom, the pencils, sharpened for Monday, the small chairs, the substitute teacher. I thought, she knows now. Everyone knows now. You got there. The room was cold from the broken window. The wood stove was ticking. Somewhere outside, a car was moving fast on a Vermont road, getting closer. Okay, Jake said, quietly, just for me. Yes, I said. And for the first time in 3 years, sitting on the floor of my studio with my back against the wall and blood in my mouth and my hands still shaking, I meant it without condition. I was choosing, in that moment, to mean it.
Jake, I had been at the window for 45 minutes, not at the window. I was in my house, doing the things I do in the evening, moving through the ordinary motions. But I was at the window in the sense that every few minutes my feet took me there, and I looked at the cottage and looked at the light in the second bedroom and looked at the road. She'd said 1 hour. I'd said 1 hour. We'd agreed, but... At 11:14, I picked up my phone and called her. 6 rings, voicemail. She might be deep in the recording. She might have her phone on silent. She might be in the middle of something that required both hands and couldn't be interrupted. All of this was possible and reasonable and made complete sense. My phone rang. Dorothy. 11:17 p.m. Dorothy Briggs, who had been in bed for 2 hours. I answered before it rang twice. Jake. Her voice wasn't completely level. Not panicked. Dorothy does not panic. But underneath was something urgent and certain. Nadia is in trouble. I was already moving, out the back door, 40 feet. I covered it in the dark in seconds, coming around the east side of the cottage where the studio window faced the backyard. From inside through the window I could hear a voice. Not Nadia. A man's voice, low and controlled. And then Nadia's voice, slightly higher than normal but steady. She was buying time. She knew I was coming, or she didn't know, and she was buying time on instinct. Either way, she was doing it right, and I needed to be worthy of it. I went through the window, through the glass, over the seal, and straight into the room. Voss. I saw him before his mind caught up to what was happening. Dark jacket, back half-turned, something in his right hand that caught the laptop light. A knife. Nadia against the wall, his other hand in her hair, and something on her face that was terror, managed into function. The face of a woman who has decided she is not done yet. I had his arm before he fully registered that I was in the room. Wrist in my right hand, elbow in my left, and I applied the mechanical knowledge that the Army gives you about what the human arm will and won't do under controlled pressure, and the knife went to the floor, and I put him against the wall. I want to tell you that I was calm. I want to tell you it was professional and controlled, and I was fully in command of everything. I was mostly calm, mostly. There was a part of me, the part that had crossed 40 feet of dark yard with Dorothy's 4 words in my ears, that was not calm at all. That part looked at the wall where Nadia was sitting and the bruise already forming on her arm and the mark at her temple where she'd hit something, and it wanted very much to not be calm. I kept it contained, just barely. I focused on the weight against my forearm, the man I was holding, the specific pressure required to keep him there without crossing any lines I'd have to answer for later. I focused on Nadia's voice asking if the recording was running. Recording, right, good. The 12 minutes between Nadia's call and Rhea's arrival were the longest 12 minutes I've experienced since the Army, and in the Army there were longer ones. But those ones didn't have Nadia Vasquez sitting on the floor across the room, watching me with those dark eyes, choosing every 30 seconds to keep breathing and stay present. I looked at her every time I could, each time she looked back, steady, real, there. When Reyes came through the front door with 2 state troopers, I stepped back from Voss and let them take him, and I crossed the room to where Nadia was still on the floor, and I sat down next to her, and she turned into me exactly the way she had the morning I'd told her about Gus. Complete, unguarded, every defense down. I put my arms around her, and I held on. "I've got you," I whispered into her hair. "You came through the window. For me," she said, muffled against my shoulder. "The door was locked," I said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. Reyes stood in the doorway of the studio looking at us with the expression of a detective who has seen a lot of things and has decided that this particular thing, right here, is not her business. "When you're ready," she said and stepped back. We weren't ready for another 10 minutes. When we did go out, the night was cold and the stars were doing their Vermont thing, and Hazel Creek was quiet around us with the specific quiet of a place where something has been resolved, finally, at considerable cost. Dorothy was on the porch. Of course she was. She looked at Nadia and she opened her arms, and Nadia went into them, and Dorothy held her with the strength of a woman who has been the center of this town for longer than most of us have been alive. "There," Dorothy said, "just that. There." I stood on the porch and I looked at the road and I thought about Gus, about 31 years and Rosie and the daughter in Burlington and the laugh from 2 rooms away, about what was owed to him and whether anything we'd done tonight came close to paying it. It didn't. It never does. But it was something. It was the truth, finally, and the man responsible, finally. And whatever came next, the trials, the testimony, the long work of the justice system making its way through this the way it makes its way through everything. At least it was aimed in the right direction. At least it was aimed toward the truth. Gus would have said, that's enough to start with.
Nadia. The state police were there until 3 a.m. They took Daniel Voss in handcuffs through my front door, and I watched them do it. Watched him walk past me without looking at me, which I understood was its own kind of answer about who he was, that even now, even here, he couldn't look at the thing he'd done in the face. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not relief, not yet. Something quieter and more complicated. The specific feeling of a thing that has been wrong for 3 years beginning. Finally, the slow process of becoming right. They took the laptop and the recording. My entire archive, handled with the careful precision of people who understood they were holding something that was going to matter in multiple courtrooms before any of this was finished. I watched it go, and I thought about the red indicator light still running through all of it, and I thought, good. That's what it was for. That's what all of it was for. Detective Reyes sat with me for an hour. She took my statement with the focused exactness of someone who is genuinely good at what they do, which I recognized because I had spent a decade trying to be the same thing. And there is a specific quality of attention that belongs to people who care about getting it right. She wrote everything down. She asked the right questions. She didn't rush. At the end of it, she told me that Marcus Webb's cooperation agreement was almost certainly going to be revisited in light of what the recording contained. That the Ashworth family would need to be notified. That there would be more interviews, more testimony, a long road through the legal system that wouldn't be finished quickly or cleanly. "Are you okay with that?" she asked. I thought about it. Really thought. Not the reflexive answer, not the professional one, but the true one. Sitting with what it would actually cost me to go back into it. The case. The work. The thing that had broken me into pieces 4 months ago and left me Googling small Vermont towns at midnight. "Yes," I said, but differently this time. She looked at me, waiting. "I know where the gap was," I said. "I know what I missed and where and why. That's..." I stopped, found the words. "That's not the same as carrying it as a failure. It's just the next step. There's a difference." Reyes nodded slowly. "The Ashworth family is going to want to hear from you." "I know," I said.
I want to hear from them too. After she left, the cottage was quiet in the way that spaces are quiet after they've held something large. Not empty, exactly. More like exhaled. Dorothy had gone home at 1. She had protested, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who considers leaving someone alone after trauma to be a moral failing, and I had walked her to her door and held her hands for a moment and told her I was all right. And she had looked at me with those gray eyes that see everything and said, "I know you are. I just want to make sure you know it too." Then she'd gone inside, and I'd stood on her porch for a moment in the cold Vermont dark, listening to the creek, before walking back. Jake was still there. Of course he was still there. He was sitting on my couch with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them. And he looked up when I came in, and something in me that had been braced since 11 o'clock at night, maybe longer, maybe since the morning Gus died, maybe since I'd pressed play on a 43-minute audio file, came loose at the specific sight of him, just loosened, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long it had forgotten it was a knot. We sat together, not talking, not needing to. The wood stove was going, ticking steadily in the way it had ticked through all of it, indifferent and warm, and the night outside was cold and clear and the kind of quiet that only exists in small places where people have gone to sleep, trusting that tomorrow will come. I looked at my hands in my lap. The shaking had stopped somewhere around the time Reyes arrived. My shoulder ached with a deep, specific persistence that I knew from experience was going to be considerably worse by morning. "How's the arm?" he said, quietly, not looking at me, looking at the stove, giving me the space to answer without being watched. "Spectacular bruise," I said. "I'll live." "I should have—" "Don't," I said. He looked at me then. "Don't do that," I said. "Don't sit here and second-guess every minute before you came through that window. You came through a window, Jake. In the dark. In under a minute." I held his eyes. "You don't get to apologize for anything that happened before that." He was quiet for a long moment. "Dorothy called me at 11:17, he said. She just said go. That's all. Go." A pause. "I was already watching your window." "I know," I said. "I know you were." I turned to look at him on the couch. He was tired in a way I had never seen him tired. Not worn down, not diminished, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent a significant amount of himself on something that mattered and is only now, in the quiet, beginning to account for what it cost him. The soldier, who had been so close to the surface tonight, was receding. What was left underneath was just Jake. Just this man who had built a town and come through a window and held Daniel Voss against a wall with one arm until the sirens arrived. I watched him, and I felt, underneath all the terror and the adrenaline and the grief and the exhaustion, something assembling itself quietly in my chest. Something that had been building for weeks in the patient, incremental way of things that are real and therefore don't rush. I was going to tell him. Not yet, but soon. At some point, I became aware that I was listing slightly to the left. That my body, which had been running on adrenaline and professional reflexes and the specific determination not to fall apart in front of Detective Reyes, had begun to quietly submit a bill for the evening. Jake noticed before I said anything. He always noticed. He stood up from the couch and he turned to face me, and he held out his hand. Not a question exactly, more like an offer. The same quality as come anyway, certain without demanding, present without pressure. "Come on," he said, quietly. "You're done for tonight." "I can walk," I said. "I know you can," he said. "Let me anyway." I looked at his hand. I thought about the 40 feet between our houses and the casserole dish and the first evening on the porch, and every increment of distance that had closed between us in the weeks since, each one chosen, each one meaning something. I thought about a man who had waited since October with complete certainty, who had never pushed,
who had come through a window in the dark when an hour turned out to be too long. I took his hand. He drew me up from the couch, and I stood, and the room tilted very slightly at the edges, not badly, just the honest accounting of a body that had hit a wall and spent several hours in a state of sustained terror and was now presenting its invoice. I steadied. Jake's hand was at my back, steady and warm, and then he made a decision. He bent, and he picked me up. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, not with fanfare. Just the simple, deliberate motion of a man who has assessed a situation and determined what it requires. One arm under my knees, one at my back, and I was off the floor. And I didn't protest. Because the truth was that every part of me that would have protested had been used up somewhere between the wall and the floor of my studio, and what was left didn't have the energy for pride. I put my head against his shoulder. He carried me down the short hallway to the bedroom. The wood stove's warmth reached even here, and the room was dark except for the faint, cold light coming through the window. The Vermont dark, full of stars, the kind that has weight to it. He set me down on the edge of the bed with a care that was so deliberate it made my throat tighten, and he pulled the quilt back, and I lay down, and he drew it up over me. I looked up at him standing at the edge of the bed, in the dark, and I said, "Don't go." He didn't answer with words. He just came around to the other side and lay down on top of the quilt beside me, fully dressed, close enough that his warmth was immediate and real, and he put his arm around me and drew me against his side the way he had that first night on the couch, and I tucked my face against his shoulder. And he held me. That was all. That was everything. I cried. Quietly, without trying to stop it. Not from fear, not from grief exactly, but from the specific, overwhelming relief of being on the other side of something terrible and knowing that you made it, and knowing that you are not on the other side of it alone, the kind of tears that have been waiting for a room that felt safe enough to exist in. He didn't say anything. He didn't make it smaller or try to move it along. He just held me completely, without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it was. And I cried until I was done, and then I lay quietly in the dark and listened to his heartbeat, steady and unhurried, and let it slow my own. When I could speak again, I told him what was on the recording. All of it. The 31-minute mark, the timeline, Voss's voice saying I got back Sunday evening, around 7:30, what it meant for the case and for Marcus Webb's cooperation agreement and for the long road still ahead. He listened without interrupting, without offering, without trying to shape it. Just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Claire Ashworth," he said. "Yes," I said. "She gets justice now." "She does." I felt the truth of it move through me, not triumphant, not clean, but real. She does. Finally, after 3 years and a coffee shop and 2 words in a margin and everything it had taken to get here. Finally. He pulled me closer. I tucked further into his side. Outside the window, Hazel Creek was sleeping, the covered bridge there in the dark, and the general store, and Dorothy's house 2 doors down with its light off now, and the road that curved into town the way it always had, the way it had since Emmett Rafferty built his bridge across the creek in 1886, and a town had decided to grow up around it. I stared at the ceiling for a while. "I'm extending the lease," I said. His chest rose with something that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a laugh. "Dorothy mentioned she'd be open to something longer." "She mentioned it to me 2 weeks ago," I said. "She's been waiting." "Dorothy's always waiting," he said. "She has infinite patience." "Unlike some people." "I am," he said, with absolute seriousness. "The most patient man you have ever met." "You came through a window." "That was efficiency," he said, "not impatience. There's a distinction." I laughed. The real one, surprised and full and coming from somewhere genuine, somewhere that had not been available to me a few hours ago, somewhere I thought might have been closed for a while and turned out not to be. I felt it all the way through me, all the way down through the exhaustion and the residue of fear and the ache in my shoulder and the relief still settling into the spaces between things like warmth finding its level. He felt it too. I could tell by the way his arm tightened slightly around me. Not much, just the acknowledgement of it. I lay in the dark with my head on his shoulder, and I thought about everything it had taken to get here. The bathroom floor in Brooklyn, the midnight Google search, Dorothy's soup, and Pauline's cheddar and a casserole dish held with complete unselfconscious ease. 20 minutes on a Vermont road when I had been, just briefly, only a woman driving with the window down. I thought about what he'd said on his porch before I walked back across the 40 feet to press play on a recording that changed everything. You are not the same person who broke the first time. He had been right. I hadn't known it then. I knew it now. Jake, I said. Nadia, he said. I love you. Direct, the way I do things, when I've decided. No preamble, no approach, no careful construction of the statement. Just the true thing, said plainly, because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it without ornamentation. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, holding it, the way he held things that mattered. I know, he said. I've been waiting for you to get there. I stared at the ceiling. Since when? The Harvest Festival, he said. When you laughed at the apple barrel and tried to take it back. That was October. You take your time, he said. Not unkind, not impatient, just true, the way he was true about things. That's... Jake, that's 2 months of you knowing and not... I love you too, he said. Quietly, simply, into the dark. I've loved you since October. I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment, I said, with feeling, was 2 months ago. The right moment, he said, is whenever you're ready for it. That's what makes it the right moment. I turned my head to look at him in the dark. This man, this specific, particular, infuriating man who had come back from war and built a town and held a line and waited, with complete, unhurried, absolute certainty, for me to arrive at what he'd already known. You are so annoying, I said. The laugh was quiet and real, and I felt it in his chest under my ear. You love it. He was right. God help me, he was right. I closed my eyes. His arm was around me, and his heartbeat was steady, and the wood stove was ticking in the other room, and outside the window the stars were doing their extravagant Vermont thing, wall to wall, no restraint. And Hazel Creek was sleeping. And the creek was moving over the rocks, and the covered bridge had been there since 1886, and would be there tomorrow. I slept. Not visited by the classroom, not this time.
And this is where our story ends for today. If you enjoyed tagging along for this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this story is worth sharing, and it lets me know to create more content like this. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next chapter, subscribe and ring that bell. I've got more stories lined up that you definitely won't want to miss. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.